Hello, everyone, and happy California Clean Air Day. Thank you all for tuning in for our second public webinar on the 2020 Mobile Source Strategy. We at CARB are really happy to have this opportunity to speak with you again and to hear your feedback in response to the workshop discussion draft that we released last week. I'm Ariel Fiddledye, and I work in our air quality planning branch within CARB. Before we get going, there's a couple housekeeping things I just want to touch on. First off, we want everyone to know that this webinar is being recorded, and so it will be available online later. But as such, please do note that the questions you ask verbally or write to us in the questions feature will be a part of this recording and part of the public record for this webinar going forward. For anybody that's not using GoToWebinar, please know that the slides are available online on our website. That's www.arb.ca.gov/resources/2020-mobile-source-strategy. If you go to CARB's homepage and use the search function, or even type 2020 Mobile Source Strategy CARB into Google or another search engine, you should be able to find it. So before we get into things, we'd also like to introduce the team here at CARB for the 2020 Mobile Source Strategy. So let me we're all gonna pop on here and say hi. So hi everybody, I'm Ariel Fiddledye, and as I mentioned, I work within our air quality planning branch.
Hello, I'm Sylvia Vandersbeck, and I'm Chief of the Air Quality Planning Branch, overseeing the Mobile Source Strategy. Joshua?
Sure, I can share my webcam. Good morning, Joshua Cunningham, Chief of the Advanced Clean Cars Branch, and advising the light-duty vehicle chapter for this analysis. Thank you.
Good morning, I'm Belinda Chen. I'm a staff in the Advanced Clean Cars Regulation section.
Good morning, my name is Kathy Zhao. I'm Manager of Transportation System Planning Sections in Sustainable Transportation and Community Division.
And good morning, everyone. Sorry, I don't have my screen available. My laptop isn't working great, but I wanted to introduce myself. My name is Nicole Dolney, and I am the Chief over the Transportation Planning Branch. I will be giving the presentation on the VMT portion, and as part of that, I also want to acknowledge a big team that has put in this effort, including the lead staff person, Heather King.
Sam, I think you're on mute.
Hello, everyone. This is Sam Fornazeri. I'm the Chief of the Mobile Source Analysis Branch. With I oversaw the mobile source scenarios for the heavy duty as well as off-road sector.
Here.
So Fong Yan is also on. Let me try and unmute her. It seems we're having a little difficulty here. We'll have to come back to her. Let me skip forward. Sorry, let me take care of that. I think Sarah was next.
Hey everyone, my name is Sarah Forestieri, and I work staff in the on-road model development section.
Kari here.
I'm not sure, but Fong should be available now. I just elevated her to panelist. Sorry about that, Fong.
Hi, yeah, this is Fang Yan. I'm the manager for on-road mobile development section. Your section is taking care of the scenario analysis for on-road sectors. Thank you.
Hi everyone, my name is Liang Liu. I'm the staff in off-road diesel analysis section, and I'll be covering the mobile source strategy for the off-road sectors for you.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Michael Benjamin. I'm Chief of the Air Quality Planning and Science Division, and I have overall responsibility for development of the mobile source strategy.
All right, thanks everyone. So moving forward, today, as you see here, we'll be going through a broad overview, including the background on why we're here and the progress made on the measures included in the 2016 mobile source strategy. Moving forward into discussions of the 2020 mobile source strategy scenarios that were released in the workshop discussion draft, touching on regulatory concepts that CARB staff have identified to help move us forward for each mobile sector. And then we'll also go through the estimates included in the draft for the funding needed and estimated vehicle and equipment costs of the needed transition to cleaner technology. I'd also like to mention up front that we are accepting questions through GoToWebinar application for those of you guys online today. And we're going to be doing that both through the written questions function and also verbally. We plan to hearing all comments at a couple points, a couple intervals during the presentation, and then at the end. So you will see slides when we're going to take questions at a couple intervals. But of course, you can feel free to send us the written comments and questions throughout, and then we'll address them in order after when we get to those breaks. So before we get into the background, I want to let everyone know what our timeline looks like for the development of the 2020 strategy. California Senate Bill 44, or SB 44, signed by Governor Newsom on September 20th, 2019, it acknowledged the ongoing need for evaluation of opportunities for the mobile source emission reductions in relation to the state's numerous air quality, climate, and community risk reduction goals, as well as the ever-evolving vehicle market. And thus it requires CARB to update our 2016 mobile source strategy by January 1, 2021, and then every 5 years thereafter. It's because of the SB 44 requirements that we are on the timeline that you see here on this slide, rather than a longer process that we might usually take for this sort of a broad planning document. Scenario modeling is well underway, and as it is an iterative process, it will continue throughout development. We, of course, held our first workshop back in March, provided an update to our board in April, and as everyone here knows, released our workshop discussion draft of the strategy just last week. The final step in the process will be to go back to our board for consideration of the strategy at the end of this year. One thing we'd like to make clear up front is that the 2020 mobile source strategy is taking a conceptual scenario approach to planning. The 2020 strategy consists of the scenarios and trajectories for the various mobile sectors in the state that are needed in order to meet our numerous goals, recognizing the programs that are already in development, as well as the newly identified concepts that will help move us forward. While a scenario may outline the overall approach for a sector and include program concepts that will move the state in the needed direction, the specific strategies for each sector will continue to be refined as the planning and public process for implementing specific actions moves forward. The concepts contained in the 2020 strategy are less defined than the measures included in the 2016 strategy, in part due to the accelerated timeframe required under SB 44. The concepts, though, will continue to be developed and translated into measures for the next state SIP strategy being developed for the 70 parts per billion 8-hour ozone standard, and the next climate change scoping plan, community emission reduction plans, or other CARB planning documents to be released in the coming years. Another important point we want to make up front is that this document is exclusively focused on mobile sources. As many are aware, in California, local air districts are primarily responsible for control of stationary and area sources within their jurisdiction, but it is of note that they also often achieve reductions from mobile sources through targeted use of incentives funds, since this is where funds can have the greatest emission reduction impact. All right, I'm now going to get a little bit more into the background behind the 2020 mobile source strategy. As you all know, CARB and California as a whole have a great number of targets and goals we're working to meet over the next 30 years. We have various state implementation plan attainment years for the South Coast and the San Joaquin Valley, the two areas with the most significant ozone and PM 2.5 challenges in the nation, including very near-term targets in 2023, 24, and 25, and 2031 and 37 for the more recent ozone national ambient air quality standards. There is also an immediate need to achieve reductions in our AB 617 communities with target years for the first communities beginning in 2024, as well as just reducing emissions in all of the highly impacted communities throughout our state. Climate goals include the midterm target in 2030 for 40% GHG reduction below 1990 levels, and then longer term targets in 2045 for carbon neutrality and 2050 for 80% below 1990 levels. As I mentioned a few minutes ago, SB 44 requires that CARB update the mobile source strategy by January 1, 2021, and then every 5 years going forward. More specifically, SB 44 requires CARB to update the 2016 mobile source strategy for the medium and heavy-duty vehicle sector to include a comprehensive strategy for the deployment of medium and heavy-duty vehicles for the purpose of meeting federal ambient air quality standards and reducing greenhouse gas emissions. It also directs CARB to set reasonable and achievable goals for reducing emissions by 2030 and 2050 from medium and heavy-duty vehicles that are consistent with the state's overall goals. More recently, on September 23rd, 2020, Governor Newsom signed Executive Order N7920, which established a goal that 100% of California sales of new passenger car and trucks be zero emission by 2035. In addition, the governor's order set a goal to transition all drayage trucks to zero emission by 2035, all off-road equipment to zero emission where feasible by 2035, and the remainder of medium and heavy-duty vehicles to zero emission where feasible by 2045. Consistent with the Executive Order N7920 and SB 44, in the 2020 strategy, staff have identified a suite of strategy concepts, many of which CARB is actively pursuing through individual public processes that will enable the state to achieve the technology trajectories identified through scenario planning and consequently meet California's many goals. Defining the scope of actions necessary to implement a strategic vision to meet all of California's goals and the requirements of SB 44 and EO N7920 will require an integrated planning process. In order to identify the strategies and program concepts that will best help move us to meet all of CARB's goals, it's imperative to look at the goals and potential benefits to all three broad and overlapping groups of pollutants that we're striving to reduce: criteria pollutants, toxics, and greenhouse gases. This type of planning effort is essential to address the interplay between pollutants and sources and consider the benefits of different technologies and energy sources. It's important to acknowledge that for all CARB's major planning efforts, strategies to control mobile source emissions will be vital to their success. Mobile sources and the fossil fuels that power them continue to contribute a majority of emissions of oxides of nitrogen, a significant precursor to smog and particulate matter, and are the largest portion of greenhouse gas emissions in California. The chart on the left shows 2017 statewide NOx emissions as derived from CARB's 2019 CPAM planning inventory, with mobile sources representing 80% of that total. The pie chart on the right here shows 2017 statewide greenhouse gas emissions, where the transportation sector represents 40% of the total. While the terminology used is different between the two charts, I would like to point out that the mobile and transportation categories are analogous on these pie charts. Controlling emissions from mobile and all sources is critically important because of the cost that air pollution has on the health of the residents of California. CARB analyses have concluded that PM 2.5 exposure contributes to 5,400 premature deaths due to cardiopulmonary causes per year in California. In addition, PM 2.5 contributes to about 2,800 hospitalizations for cardiovascular and respiratory diseases and about 6,700 emergency room visits from asthma each year in California. The subset of PM that is from diesel sources, known as diesel particulate matter, has been determined to be a toxic and thus also increases cancer risk. In addition to the health effects on the overall population, studies have shown that disadvantaged communities and people of color in the state are disproportionately affected. As can be seen on this slide, 46% of census tracts in the state that are disadvantaged by definition are in the 75th percentile for levels of diesel PM pollution, and Black and Hispanic communities are exposed to PM 2.5 at concentrations 18% above the average from on-road mobile sources. We at CARB strive to reduce the negative impacts of pollution on everyone in California, but especially since the passing of AB 617 in 2017, we've had the opportunity to take a closer look and dedicate specific resources to reducing these health effects on the most heavily impacted communities and populations in the state. And reductions in mobile source emissions are a critical piece of that complex puzzle. Next, I'm going to recap a little bit of the progress that has been made since the 2016 mobile source strategy. As many of you know, the 2016 mobile source strategy was released in May of 2016. It demonstrated how the state could simultaneously meet air quality standards, achieve greenhouse gas emission reduction targets, decrease health risk from transportation emissions, and reduce petroleum consumption through 2031. Elements of the 2016 strategy were incorporated into the 2016 state SIP strategy and built upon for other plans, including the 2017 scoping plan, the California Sustainable Freight Action Plan, and CARB's short-lived climate pollutant reduction strategy. Each of these plans drew from the mobile source strategy to incorporate actions and policies necessary to meet their individual program goals. Since the 2016 mobile source strategy was completed, a number of regulatory items that were included as measures in the document have been completed and adopted by CARB's board. These include the medium and heavy duty GHG phase 2 regulation, the lower opacity limits for heavy duty vehicles, amended warranty requirements for heavy duty vehicles, the innovative clean transit regulation, and the zero emission airport shuttle bus regulation. Just this summer though, 3 additional critically important programs were adopted by the CARB board. These are the Advanced Clean Trucks Regulation, the Heavy Duty Omnibus Regulation, and the Control Measure for Ocean-Going Vessels at Berth. The last mile delivery measure in the 2016 strategy envisioned a regulation with a strong focus on last mile delivery vehicles. Through the regulatory development process, the program evolved substantially into the Advanced Clean Trucks Regulation, which includes many other heavy-duty vehicle applications beyond last mile delivery and requires medium and heavy-duty vehicle manufacturers to sell ZEVs at an increasing portion of their annual sales beginning in 2024. Heavy-duty omnibus regulation was originally just the low NOx standard in our 2016 strategy, but now includes longer useful life emission compliance, longer warranty periods, and more stringent in-use performance standards, all which will improve real-world emissions performance of heavy-duty vehicles. The recently adopted control measure for ocean-going vessels at berth expands the existing at-berth regulation to include additional vessel types and visits, as well as additional ports and terminals, as originally envisioned in the 2016 strategy. In addition to those that have been adopted, many other items that were included as measures have progressed through the development process and are slated to come to the CARB board for consideration in the next couple of years. The Transport Refrigeration Unit, or TRU regulation, Small Off-Road Engine, or SOAR regulation, the Heavy Duty Inspection and Maintenance Program, Advanced Clean Cars 2, as well as the Low Emission Diesel Fuel Requirement, all planned to be brought to the CARB board in 2021. Additionally, the Zero Emission Forklift Regulation is under development, with staff looking to bring a regulation to the board in 2022, and they actually have their first webinar coming up this afternoon. With that recap of the 2016 strategy, we're now going to shift into a discussion of the scenarios and concepts included in the 2020 mobile source strategy. Before diving into specifics, I'd like to just mention again what the scenarios in the 2020 strategy represent. These scenarios are driven by California's air quality goals in 2031, 37, and climate change goals in 2030, 2040, 2035, 2045, and beyond. The scenarios show what level of transformation is needed in each sector to achieve the state's many goals and are not directly associated with a specific regulation or programmatic concept. Meeting air quality and climate change goals requires significant transformations to cleaner technologies across mobile source sectors. No single tool alone will get us to these goals, so meeting them requires many tools as shown here, including manufacturer requirements, end user requirements, incentives, and outreach. The 2020 MSS includes scenarios for both on-road and off-road sectors. These pie charts again show the contributions of the mobile sector to overall statewide NOx and greenhouse gas emissions, but here we have it broken down, showing the individual mobile sectors: on-road light duty, medium duty and heavy duty, and off-road. Here we're going to be starting with the on-road sector, which of course includes a wide variety of light, medium, and heavy-duty vehicles. This sector is important in terms of emissions and contributed to 45% of NOx emissions and 37% of GHG emissions statewide in 2017. With that, I'm now going to turn it over to Belinda Chen to dive a little deeper into the scenarios that are being developed as a part of the 2020 mobile source strategy, starting with the on-road light-duty sector.
Thanks, Ariel. Good morning, everyone. As Ariel mentioned, I'm Belinda Chen from the Advanced Clean Cars Regulation section in the Sustainable Transportation and Communities Division. Next slide, please. So our approach in developing the light duty scenario was to make assumptions that are aggressive but possible. So using commercialized vehicle and fuel technologies, even though some of these may not be widespread yet. It's important to note that we did not assess the costs associated with these scenarios as we would in a formal rulemaking setting. These are just exploratory scenarios to understand the path we would need to put the light duty sector on to meet air quality and climate goals. Next slide. So here on the left is the sales mix we assumed for new vehicles. You can see that sales of conventional vehicles, which includes internal combustion engine vehicles and non-plug-in hybrids, fall to 0% in 2035. However, for the time that they are in the mix, greenhouse gas emissions of these new vehicles are assumed to fall 2% each year after 2025. We assume that NOx tailpipe emissions for these new vehicles would remain constant at 2025 levels, with the expectation that these scenario emission reductions would come from the greater sales penetration of zero-emission vehicles like battery, fuel cell, and plug-in hybrid electric vehicles. Nicole will talk more about this in the next section, but we also assumed aggressive reductions in vehicle miles traveled, or VMT, that equated to a 25% reduction below the 2005 levels by 2035. On the fuel side, the growing share of electric vehicles are assumed to be charged from an increasingly decarbonized electric grid. However, consistent with SB 100 in 2030 and 2045, we assume that there would still be 10% of fossil natural gas allowed in 2045. Hydrogen used for light-duty vehicle applications was assumed to be fully renewable by 2045 as well. And for the remaining conventional vehicles, we did not assume any drop in renewable gasoline, but did assume that the ethanol blended into the conventional E10 fuel would be lower carbon than today's ethanol. And that would occur from ethanol facility efficiency improvements, as well as carbon capture and sequestration. The sales assumptions from the previous slide result in this on-road fleet technology mix. From 2030 to 2045, the population of plug-in hybrids, battery electric vehicles, and fuel cells grows from a little less than 30% of the on-road fleet to 85% of the fleet, with the majority being battery electric vehicles. You can also see, though, that because new vehicles can typically last well beyond 10 years, conventional vehicles remain in the fleet past 2045, creating a continued demand for gasoline. This fleet mix results in a 41% reduction in tailpipe NOx in 2037 below the 2037 baseline, which is shown on the left, and an 87% reduction below the 2020 baseline in well-to-wheel greenhouse gas emissions in 2045, which is shown on the right. As I noted before, we had assumed that there would still be some natural gas used for electricity generation, which is why you see some emissions associated with electricity. Hydrogen upstream emissions are barely perceptible on this chart on the right due to both the assumption that hydrogen will be produced renewably in the latter years and the relatively low volume of fuel cell vehicles in the fleet when hydrogen is not produced renewably in the earlier years. Therefore, 73% of the remaining greenhouse gas emissions in 2045 will come from the gasoline used in conventional vehicles and plug-in hybrids. In summary, fully achieving carbon neutrality and meeting our clean air requirements will depend on strategies beyond tailpipe emission standards or zero emission vehicle requirements. We're going to need significant incentives to accelerate vehicle turnover, support the secondary vehicle market, and build out infrastructure with a strong focus on low income and otherwise disadvantaged residents. On the land use side, better planning that brings housing closer to jobs and key destinations, as well as investments in walking, biking, transit, and shared mobility to provide alternatives to driving. And then lastly, clean renewable fuels will be needed on a wide scale using limited supplies of biomass where appropriate and leveraging battery electric vehicles for grid services and electric storage. And so now I'm going to turn it over to Nicole Dolney, who's the Chief of the Transportation Systems Planning Branch.
Great, thank you, Belinda. Good morning, everyone. You can go to the next slide, please. Okay, great. So my presentation today is about the important role of vehicle miles traveled, or VMT, in meeting our environmental and public health goals. As you saw in an earlier slide presented by Ariel, transportation accounts for a significant portion of California's air pollution emissions and greenhouse gases. And while we're successfully deploying cleaner vehicles every day, gains are outpaced by increases in vehicle miles traveled. Electric vehicles and clean energy provide deep reductions in emissions, but they alone are not enough to meet our goals. As shown in the figure on this slide that Belinda presented earlier, even with aggressive sales of ZEVs, the transition will not happen quickly enough and combustion engines will remain in operation for some time to come. But there are other important reasons to curb the growth in VMT. The communities in which we all live are shaped by transportation and land use decisions and investments. Unfortunately, that's resulted in many being left with little choice but to spend significant time and money commuting. Where we put roads and housing also imposes and reinforces long-standing racial and economic injustices by placing a disproportionate burden on low-income Californians who end up paying the highest proportion of their wages for housing and transportation. Growth in VMT, where it involves or incentivizes land conversion, impedes our ability to store carbon and maintain resilient ecosystems and the life-sustaining resources they provide, including clean air, food, and water. So it's imperative that we make progress at the intersection of housing and transportation to reduce VMT. Next slide. Oops, sorry. Okay. So in developing the last mobile source strategy, we determined that meeting 2030 climate and 2031 air quality goals required 1, implementation of each of the region's sustainable community strategies, which combined would achieve about a 19% reduction in GHG per capita relative to 2005, plus additional VMT reductions from state and local efforts, getting us to about 25% reduction. Looking to the future, as we plan for attainment of the 70 ppb ozone standard and carbon neutrality goals, even deeper reductions in VMT will be necessary. However, it's important to note that currently the region's sustainable community strategies are not being fully implemented. VMT per capita is increasing instead of decreasing, and the state is not on track to achieve the reductions envisioned under SB 375. Therefore, foundational to achieving VMT reductions will be successful implementation of the region's SCSs. In the following slides, I'll talk about some of those strategies that will get us back on track and achieve these deeper reductions. Next slide. Some of the ways that we can reduce VMT to meet these goals include promoting SCS implementation to secure and sustain emission reductions from SB 375, developing a VMT and greenhouse gas mitigation bank to assist with SB 743 implementation, making transit easier to use through programs like the California Integrated Travel Program, and exploring non-regressive transportation pricing and demand management strategies. Next slide. Measures that CARB and agency partners could take include securing and sustaining emission reductions from SB 375. SB 375 intends to align planning for housing, land use, transportation, and GHG reductions. However, several issues impede its success. We need to update SB 375 targets and the target metric to better align with current planning assumptions. In addition, few districts are implementing RTP or SCSs as envisioned, such that the state is not on track to meeting current SB 375 targets. We need to clarify what it means for a project to be consistent with the SCS to promote its implementation and secure emission reductions. This could take the form of a framework of relevant criteria for evaluating projects that are consistent with the SCS, and the SCS is approved by CARB. And those could be used to help prioritize state investments. While cities and counties across California have developed local and county climate action plans to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and increase climate resiliency, few capture the benefits from conserving, restoring, and managing natural working lands. Identifying priority conservation areas within SCSs will be as important as identifying priority development areas. Lastly, CARB and other state agencies could partner with air districts to develop and share best practices on how to design and implement local rules and policies to meet local transportation, land use, and housing needs while meeting state climate goals. Next slide. SB 743 updates the way transportation impacts are measured in California for new development projects. Specifically, public agencies will no longer identify localized traffic congestion as a significant impact on the environment under the California Environmental Quality Act, or CEQA, and will focus on comprehensive travel impacts instead. CEQA has always required impacts to be mitigated to the extent feasible, and SB 743 presents unique opportunities to streamline and lower the costs for infill development projects in low VMT areas and identify and mitigate the environment and the environmental impacts from VMT. The state could help develop a mitigation bank to assist with the transfer of funds that can be deployed to projects that reduce VMT. For example, the state has experienced funding community-led, feasible, equitable, quantifiable VMT mitigation projects. These include the Clean Mobility Options Voucher Pilot, which currently provides over $28 million to low-income and disadvantaged communities for car sharing, bike sharing, and other clean mobility projects, including funding for community transportation needs assessments. The new Sustainable Transportation and Equity Project, or STEP, which funds clean transportation solutions through a community-based approach to identify and address unique mobility needs of a given community. And the Strategic Growth Council's Sustainable Agricultural Land Conservation Program, which protects and conserves natural working lands at risk of development. Next slide. There are hundreds of transit agencies in California with no uniform way to plan and pay for a trip. Creating an easy-to-use standardized payment method across California would help increase transit ridership, reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and support equity. The California State Transportation Agency, or CalSTA, and its partners are engaged in an initiative to facilitate easy and accessible travel planning and payments across California through the Integrated Travel Project, or CAL-ITP. CAL-ITP is a contactless integrated fare payment system that allows for seamless fare payment and collection across transit agencies and mobility service providers. It does not require a unique card, app, ticket, or account for each service, increasing its accessibility and usability of a diverse transportation options, especially for California's most impacted communities. CAL-ITP received $28 million in transit and intercity rail capital program funding, and in July of this year announced its first partnership demonstration with Monterey Salinas Transit to implement contactless fare payment technology. CARB is also exploring the potential to link its clean transportation and mobility incentives and rebates to CAL-ITP. In addition, the draft Clean Mile Standard regulation is considering a voluntary compliance pathway for transportation network company vehicle trips connected to transit via an integrated fare app. Next slide. California should also explore non-regressive transportation pricing and demand management. Examples of this include regionally and locally focused pricing strategies for use of certain lanes, driving in certain areas, parking in prime locations, curbside management, and driving at peak times. Pricing would need to be used in conjunction with requirements to use the resulting revenue to invest in alternatives to driving alone, with the particular focus on ensuring low-income residents have affordable access to jobs and other key destinations. We are already beginning to see pricing more prominently in the recently adopted regional transportation plans. For example, in their 2020 SCS, the Sacramento Area Council of Governments, or SACOG, included a regional facility-based congestion pricing strategy through managed express lanes on portions of the I-80 and US 50 I-5 and regional mileage-based user fee. The Southern California Associations of Government, or SCAG, also included facility-based congestion pricing through cordon zones between downtown Los Angeles and West Los Angeles, and managed express lanes throughout the regions, as well as a regional-based user fee and TNC user fee. Next slide. So in summary, new structural opportunities are underway for state agencies to collaborate on reducing VMT and simultaneously advancing crucial climate, housing, equity, and conservation goals. For example, CARB, the California Transportation Commission, and the Department of Housing and Community Development now hold biannual joint meetings to inform and initiate appropriate actions that can help better align state transportation, housing, and air quality programs. Governor Newsom's executive order, among other things, directs CalSTA to leverage the state's $5 billion transportation funding portfolio in a manner to help achieve the goals in the 2017 Climate Change Scoping Plan. CalSTA is currently developing an action plan for this effort. These important structural and philosophical shifts provide opportunities for improved collaboration and aligning decision-making across state, regional, and local agencies. Now I'm going to pass this back to Ariel to open things up for questions before we transition back to the heavy duty portion of the presentation.
Thanks, Nicole. So yeah, we're gonna first now take our first break in the presentation here to hear some of your questions and comments. We are gonna limit this to 15 minutes here, and then also during our next little intermission we do for questions. And then of course we will take all remaining questions and comments at the end of the presentation. So on GoToWebinar, please either use the raise hand feature or type something into the questions box. We'll try to take questions in the order received and kind of balance between the verbal ones and those being typed. So if you use the raise hand feature, please leave your hand up and we will call on you and unmute your microphone when it is your turn to speak. So first we're going to start with a few written questions that we had that came in. So I'll go ahead and read the first one, and then it was number one was, is the goal in EON 7920 for 100% ZEV sales by 2035 for light duty vehicles less than 8,500 pounds GVWR, or for both light duty and heavy duty?
This is Sam Parnazeri, so I'm gonna take that first question. So according to the governor's EO, there is 100% sales requirement for the light duty vehicles or passenger vehicles and trucks. For heavy duty vehicles, there are two targets for full transformation or full transition to ZEV of the fleet. One is in 2035 for drayage, truck, and short hauls, and one is in 2045 for long hauls and buses wherever feasible. Hope that answered the question.
Thanks, Sam. Okay, so question 2 that was typed in said, when speaking on slide 18, it was stated that the MSS was developed for the 2031 air quality standards and longer term GHG goals, but previous slides showed air quality deadlines and immediate health impacts of air pollution. Why does this plan not focus on 2023 and the near term impacts as required by SB 44? And I think Sylvia was gonna take this one.
Yeah, hi, this is Sylvia. I just wanted to answer the question. So first of all, SB 44 specifically specifies the GHG goals beginning in 2030. So we are addressing GHG goals in 2030 and all of the air quality goals that are 2030 and later, both for GHG and air quality. But in the slide, we wanted to acknowledge that we do have some near-term air quality targets that are still very important, that we continue to pursue as much cost-effective emission reductions as we can.
Thanks, Sylvia. All right, a couple more written ones, and then we'll switch over to taking some verbal ones. So question 3 that was typed in said, will renewable hydrogen fuel ICE vehicles be considered as a part of the ZEV fleet?
Yes, Ariel, can you hear me? This is Joshua.
Yes, we can hear you, Joshua.
Yeah, I'll take this question. Renewable hydrogen with fuel cell, renewable hydrogen with combustion vehicles certainly could provide a low carbon GHG side pathway, but it is not considered a zero emission vehicle given that there is criteria emissions at the vehicle from the combustion of the fuel. So we do not consider them a ZEV, and specifically for the ZEV executive order, they would not be part of the sales that are allowed after 2035 per the executive order.
All right, thanks, Joshua. So question 4 that came in was, what is the schedule for additional public meetings to discuss the amendments made a few days ago to the draft mobile source strategy? Will this be the only public meeting? And that was from Leah Silverthorne. So I'll just go ahead and say, as far as the process, and we're going to touch back on this at the end of the presentation, but the process for the 2020 mobile source strategy, this is going, our second webinar. We of course had the first one back in March, and then we will, again, like I mentioned, be coming to the board for consideration of the strategy. And that will be in our December board hearing of this year. And so that, of course, is a public meeting. We'll be taking feedback during that meeting. We will also be releasing another, version of the 2020 mobile source strategy, the one that will be going to the board sometime in November. So there will be other opportunities for public input through those venues. Okay, so right now I think we'll switch over and take a couple questions that people have their hands raised. So I'm just gonna say who the commenter is, and then I'll tell you when you're unmuted. You can go ahead and speak. So the first person who raised their hand was Kevin McGay. So Kevin, let me make sure I'm doing this correctly. To unmute. My apologies. I'm having difficulties. Austin, if you by any chance can help me out and figure out how to unmute. I thought I was able to do it right here. Sorry for the technical difficulties. I don't have quite enough experience with GoToWebinar still. All right.
Can
Kevin,
you hear me?
Yes. Okay, there we go. I think I got that. So you can go ahead now and ask your question.
Okay, thank you. It's nice to go first to clear up the technical difficulties. I'll be quick. I'll have more comments on specifically on the heavy duty side, but I just want to make a couple of general comments on the mobile source strategy. I think first, for me, I'm pretty concerned that the effort doesn't comply with the requirements of SB 44. SB 44 requires an update to the 2016 plan, including, quote, a comprehensive strategy to meet the air quality and climate goals. But these are just the scenarios, and it doesn't include measures, so it's not a comprehensive strategy to achieve those goals. SB 44 requires the plan to be feasible also, but without measures, we can't tell if it is or not. I mean, this is being piecemealed, if you will, and it shouldn't be. Stakeholders need to be able to comment on scenarios and implementation strategies together at the same time to provide meaningful comments. It's very hard to comment just on the scenarios and with no plan on how to actually get there. I also wanted to express pretty significant disappointment in the process of this. This is an important effort. This is a huge document. When it's whole, it's a huge document. But this is only the second public meeting, and we only got the draft a week ago. And that you mentioned that there's not going to be any more public meetings. There's none in the schedule. So I'm really concerned with how this has been done. This hasn't been very transparent at all. Thank you.
This is Sylvia Vanderstreck. I'll go ahead and answer your comment. Thank you very much for your comment and your concerns. We are working very closely with our legislative staff here to assess this document. I do want to highlight that last time that we did the mobile source strategy, we had a few years to do it. We've got it in a compressed time frame. And so we've previously had one workshop where we went over the comments. This is our second workshop. We will be having a public meeting in the future. And we appreciate everyone's comments. I'm sorry that you're disappointed in the process. We're hoping that our next update will have a little bit more time to do it. Again, thank you very much for your comment.
Yeah, I was looking back at the 2016 plan, just kind of looking at the timeline, and there was over a year and a half of development after the release of the vision tool, which essentially this is the update to the vision tool. So there was a lot more public engagement, and it was a full strategy as required by SB 44. We had a chance to comment on the vision and also the scenarios at the same time, and I think that that's the right way to do it. I'm very concerned that piecemealing it will not generate the best plan possible.
Well, again, but SB 44 requires us to take this to our board by the end of this year, and that's really why the compressed time frame is out there. But definitely, we appreciate your comments.
Thanks, Sylvia. So the next person who had their hand up was Will Barrett. So I think I have allowed you to unmute yourself now, Will. If you can try and unmute yourself, you should be able to speak, I believe.
Hi, can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you.
Perfect. So I'm Will Barrett with the American Lung Association. Thank you very much for the opportunity to weigh in here. First of all, I do appreciate having the opportunity to review the document, over the last week, and appreciate the opportunity to participate in the public process throughout the development of the draft. One of the things I want to just highlight was that this really is an important planning opportunity for making sure we're meeting our clean air goals, our climate standards, and our public health goals. We're strongly supportive of sort of the direction laid out in the plan and the executive order on the electrification side. We know that the electrification or the transportation sector is such a dominant source of the public health challenges facing Californians today, and especially our most disadvantaged communities. We think that the wholesale electrification is critical to improving public health. And we actually just released a report last week or 2 weeks ago highlighting the health benefits of a full transition to electric vehicles. And in California, that came out to approximately $22 billion in annual health benefits. I also wanted to really appreciate the fact that, as Nicole walked through, the VMT sector or segment is so critical, and really wanted to make sure that we're continuing to raise that throughout. We know we're not on track to meeting the SB 375 targets. We know that it's critical that we get on track as laid out in the SB 150 report and in the presentation. In both cases, in the electrification and in the VMT reduction, we know that there are tremendous public health benefits to be achieved. And one of the things that I would like to just kind of ask about is, within each of the individual measures that have been put forward by CARB over the years and coming into the future, we know that there's a public health evaluation that goes along with those. And I guess it's more of a recommendation is that if it's possible to see in the discussion going forward, sort of a quantification or even a qualitative evaluation of the health benefits of this shift to greater electrification, greater access to healthier mobility options. I think putting that fine point on the health benefits of this transition to more sustainable transportation across the board, whether looking at better alignment of transportation funding to active transportation, more infill development, those kind of projects, as well as the shift away from combustion of fossil fuels in the transportation sector. I think that if it's possible, that would be the recommendation, is really making sure that the public sees the public health benefits of all of these actions aggregated if possible. So that's all. I just wanted to kind of flag the importance of the work you're doing for improving public health in California, and asking that, if at all possible, to see a broader overview of the health benefits of the actions that will be kind of brought forward into the SIP and into the scoping plan from this process. Thank you very much.
Hey, Ariel, this is Nicole. Can I take a quick crack at the response for that too?
Yeah, of course.
Okay.
Go ahead, Nicole.
Thank you, Will. I really appreciate that comment. And you're right, we didn't talk about the health benefits here. And, in the scoping plan, we did see that the vast majority of the health benefits of that plan came from active transportation and some of these VMT reducing strategies. I know to the degree that you guys can provide any suggestions around how we expand that to looking at health benefits beyond reduction in tailpipe emissions or beyond increases in active transportation, we would really appreciate those suggestions. We recognize that there are critical health benefits associated with giving people greater opportunities for economic prosperity, living in communities that have that social cohesion and community amenities. But so if you have any suggestions on how to approach it from that perspective, we would really appreciate it.
Great, thanks, Nicole. I'll try and follow up with you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. So I think that's actually been 15 minutes now. So we are going to just do one more quick question that was one of our written ones, and then we'll move forward back to the presentation, I think. So the next written question we had was number 5 was for low-income communities, who would pay for the mileage-based user fees, and is this the same as toll roads? And that was from Biani Mercado.
Yes, and this is Nicole Dolney again. So thank you for that comment. We absolutely recognize that these pricing strategies need to be non-regressive. And we also recognize that revenues from this type of pricing need to be reinvested in alternative transportation modes so that people don't have to drive alone or drive necessarily in these toll lanes, that there are other options like public transportation that are available to them and that are just as convenient.
Thanks, Nicole. Okay, so like I said, that's been a little over 15 minutes now. So of course, in the interest of getting through the presentation, we are going to move forward right now. And then of course, we'll come back to questions. We'll have one more little intermission and then take the rest of the questions all at the end. I think I'm going to be turning it over to Sarah Forestieri next to get into the discussion of the on-road, medium, and heavy-duty scenarios.
Thanks, Ariel. All right, next slide. So I'll be starting with the on-road medium-duty vehicles. This category consists of vehicles that are 8,500 to 14,000 pounds in gross vehicle weight rating, or GVWR. So an example of a medium-duty vehicle could be a small local delivery truck. The sector is responsible for 5% of greenhouse gas mobile source emissions and 7% of NOx emissions statewide. CARB has strategies under development for reducing criteria pollutants and greenhouse gas emissions from the sector. These include the transformation of the fleet to zero emission technologies. One example of the agency's efforts, as Ariel mentioned before, is the Advanced Clean Trucks Regulation, which was approved by CARB's board in June. It also includes enhanced low emission vehicle regulation through Advanced Clean Cars 2. And finally, energy efficiency improvements through Phase 3 greenhouse gas standards for medium and heavy duty vehicles, which is a continuation of the Phase 2 greenhouse gas standards. Next slide. We ran a medium duty scenario that was driven by California's mid-century climate goals that transforms the medium duty vehicle sector to zero emission technologies. The major focus of this scenario is the ambitious ZEV phase-in, and here we show the specific assumptions. For earlier model years 2024 to 2030, the ZEV phase-in matches the current Advanced Clean Trucks regulation for this fleet type, after which we have a ramp up to 100% sales in 2035. Next slide. What you see here is the resulting technology mix from this scenario for the entire medium duty fleet, with internal combustion engines in gray, ZEVs in turquoise, and a black line showing the total ZEV population resulting from the scenario. As the vehicles turn over naturally and newer ZEVs enter the fleet, we can see an increasing percentage of ZEVs in the mid and long-term timeframes. By 2030, the scenario results in about 40,000 medium-duty ZEVs and 600,000 medium-duty ZEVs in 2045. Next slide. This scenario will translate to statewide NOx reductions of 0.25 tons per day and 1.1 tons per day in 2031 and 2037 respectively, as seen in the left-hand figure with the baseline in black and the mobile source scenario results in blue. The scale of fleet transformation will result in fuel savings of about 0.26 billion gallons of gasoline per year and 0.15 billion gallons of diesel per year in 2045, as you can see in the center and right-hand figures. And overall, this translates to well-to-wheel greenhouse gas emissions reductions in 2045 of approximately 3.9 million metric tons. Next slide. For on-road vehicles, the heavy-duty part is very critical. It consists of vehicles that are greater than 14,000 pounds in GVWR. Some examples of heavy-duty vehicles are buses and larger trucks. These vehicles are responsible for 33% of mobile source NOx emissions and 16% of mobile source greenhouse gas emissions. Similar to medium-duty vehicles, deployment of zero-emission technology, where possible, is one of the most important strategies for heavy-duty vehicles. Also, starting in 2024, we'll begin the ZEV sales requirements through the recently adopted Advanced Clean Trucks regulation. Also, starting that year in 2024 is CARB's heavy-duty omnibus program, which was approved by our board in August and will ensure that diesel engines have much lower NOx emissions. Another strategy is usage of renewable fuels where electrification is not feasible to ensure greenhouse gas emissions reductions. We also have continued energy efficiency improvements through the tractor-trailer greenhouse gas program and Phase 3 greenhouse gas standards. In addition to technology and efficiency improvements I listed, we also have a suite of in-use performance measures that ensure criteria pollutant emissions stay low through a vehicle's lifetime, and examples of this include a heavy-duty inspection and maintenance program. Next slide. We ran a scenario that meets the state's air quality and climate change goals. Here are the assumptions for the ZEV phase-in, or zero-emission vehicles phase-in, for newer model year 2024 plus vehicles. We modeled purchase requirements, which means that regardless of whether a vehicle is first sold or certified in California, or if the vehicle is purchased out of state and then subsequently registered as a used vehicle in California, it meets these ZEV phase-in requirements. For delivery and drayage fleets, we assumed 100% ZEV purchases starting with model year 2024 to get these fleets to 100% ZEV by 2035. We assume a ZEV phase-in that matches the Innovative Clean Transit regulation schedule for fleet segments with low annual mileage or return to base operation, which may have similar duty cycle to transit buses. For other vocational and tractor vehicle categories, we assumed a ZEV sales schedule that matches the Advanced Clean Truck sales requirements for Class 4 through 8 vocational, Class 7 through 8 tractors until model year 2030. After that, we assume ZEV purchases ramp up to 100% sales by 2035. So overall, the mobile source strategy scenario, regardless of fleet group, assumes 100% of California purchases are ZEVs in 2035. Next slide, please. What you see here is the resulting technology mix from this scenario for the entire heavy-duty fleet, with older technologies like pre-2010 certified and 2010 certified in yellow and gray, cleaner combustion engines through heavy-duty California omnibus regulation or a future federal regulation in light and dark blue, and then zero-emission vehicles in turquoise. The dotted black line corresponds to the total number of ZEVs. Because of the ambitious sales schedule I showed on the last slide, with 100% purchases being ZEV by 2035, this scenario results in a significant penetration of ZEVs for newer model year vehicles. We also include accelerated turnover through early retirement of 94,000 vehicles with older technology like pre-2010 or 2010 certified to ZEVs in order to meet the South Coast ozone targets and the long-term climate change goals in 2045, which is shown as, this area is shown as the striped area. This is the striped area on the figure. Overall, this gives us 170,000 heavy-duty ZEVs in 2030 and 830,000 heavy-duty ZEVs in 2045. Next slide. This scenario results in significant statewide NOx reductions of 121 tons per day in 2031, which is a 57% reduction below the current baseline, and 180 tons per day reductions in 2037, which is 80% below the baseline. In 2045, this equates to 1.9 billion gallons per year in fuel savings, as shown on the right, and overall well-to-wheel greenhouse gas emissions reductions of 22 metric tons per year. Next slide. We ran an alternative scenario which assumes the current Advanced Clean Trucks sales schedule instead of an ambitious mobile source strategy schedule. We assumed accelerated turnover or early retirement of older vehicles to optional no NOx in the alternative scenario instead of ZEVs. And you can see this as kind of the yellowish orange area on that figure. And note that the number of newer model year 2024 plus ZEVs is significantly smaller in the alternative scenario relative to the mobile source strategy scenario. Next slide. Ultimately, the alternative scenario gives us similar NOx reductions in 2031 and 2037 to meet South Coast ozone standards as seen on the left. But since we have a lower fraction of ZEVs in the fleet, we get significantly less fuel savings as seen in the figure on the right. Next slide. A very key piece to this transition to zero emission technology for all the mobile source sectors is the energy and infrastructure needed to facilitate it. We know that a streamlined system that allows for massive infrastructure build-out is necessary to enable the introduction of the large number of zero emission vehicles needed to meet our goals. We have been working with our sister agencies, the California Energy Commission and the California Public Utilities Commission, by providing them with preliminary scenario results early on. As a result of this coordination, we've received draft preliminary estimates of infrastructure needs from CEC's analysis. Through this coordination, the mobile source strategy scenarios results have been extremely valuable for statewide energy demand planning. Now I will turn it over to Liang Liu to discuss off-road scenarios. Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah. Good morning, everyone. My name is Liang Liu. I'm from the off-road diesel analysis section, and I'll be covering the mobile source strategies for the off-road sector for you. Next slide, please. Off-road sector includes any type of equipment that has either off-road or marine engines. Since off-road equipment mostly has diesel engines, they are significant emitters of NOx and diesel PM. The figure here shows statewide NOx emission contributions by sector in 2017. The black dotted box covers all the different off-road sectors. Off-road contributes to about 35% of the statewide NOx emissions in 2017, with construction, agriculture, and locomotive as the three biggest emitters. As off-road regulations tend to lag on-road ones by a few years, off-road emissions will become increasingly important. Off-road NOx contribution will grow to about 37% by 2022, replacing on-road as the largest statewide NOx emitter. Next slide. The general strategies to clean up the off-road sector includes the following. First, apply zero emission technology wherever feasible. Second, for the remaining combustion engines, introduce cleaner technology such as Tier 5 standard and onboard diagnostic standard. And three, accelerate the turnover of older equipment to the cleanest available technology and retrofit with after-treatment technology. Finally, adopt hybridization and renewable fuels while electrification is not feasible to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. I'll cover the detailed strategies for each off-road sector in the following slides. Next, please. Let's start with the federal and international sources. Locomotives are significant emitters of NOx and diesel PM. The first strategy in the mobile source strategy is to push US EPA to adopt Tier 5 locomotive standard in 2028. Next, we need to significantly turn over all old line haul locomotives to Tier 4 or Tier 5. The figure on the left shows the locomotive energy use distribution by tier standard in South Coast. As you can see, Tier 4 only accounts for 4% of the total locomotive activities in 2018, which suggests rail companies are not buying new Tier 4 locomotives. The MSS scenario will push for about 90% penetration of Tier 4 and Tier 5 line hauls by 2031. The last strategy in the MSS is to replace the oldest Tier 0 and Tier 0 Plus switchers in rail yards with Tier 4 or Tier 5 by 2030. The figure on the right shows locomotive NOx emissions under MSS in the South Coast. The black dotted line shows the baseline, and MSS will reduce NOx significantly in locomotives by about 12 tons per day in 2031. Next slide. Ocean-going vessels, or OGVs, are significant emitters around the ports and coastal shipping lanes. The recently adopted rule expanded carb at birth regulation to cover more vessel types and locations. This rule is mostly focused on reducing diesel PM exposure in local communities around the ports. However, we need much more reductions from OGVs to reach the SEEP target. We need to address transit, anchorage, and manuring emissions as well. The MSS scenario aims to replace all Tier 0 to Tier 2 vessel visits with Tier 3 or cleaner by 2031. We also need to push IMO to adopt Tier 4 marine standards in 2028. We're also working with South Coast AQMD on a scenario to retrofit Tier 2 vessels, which could potentially achieve similar NOx reductions as a Tier 3 vessel. Under these ambitious actions, we can achieve about 33 ton per day NOx reductions in South Coast in 2031, which is still short of the target of 38 ton per day identified in the 2016 mobile source strategy. Note that the figure here is slightly different than the one in the discussion draft we just released because of the changing assumptions for the Tier 4 engines. Next slide. Aircraft is an important NOx emitter in South Coast. It makes up about 4.5% of the total NOx in South Coast in 2018. As US EPA standards are technology following and not stringent enough, emissions from aircraft will continue to increase, and aircraft will contribute to about 9% of the total emissions in South Coast by 2031. The first strategy in MSS is to improve aircraft operational efficiency, such as derated takeoffs, which means aircraft doesn't use 100% of the thrust setting during takeoffs, as well as reducing power usage and time spent during taxiing, which is when the aircraft is moving on the ground. The second strategy is to transition to zero-emission auxiliary power units with onboard rechargeable batteries to use fuel use and emissions. The figure on the right shows the MSS NOx emissions from aircraft compared to the baseline. Next slide. For most of the off-road sectors with smaller engines, we assume they're going full zero emission in MSS. Cargo handling equipment, or CHE, is one of these sectors. As zero emission technology for some CHE is already commercially viable, the concept here is for all CHE to begin transition to full electric operation in 2026. The figure on the left shows statewide CHE population distribution under the MSS, and the figure on the right shows NOx emissions and the MSS compared to the baseline. As you can see, almost all CHE will become full electric by 2040s. Next slide. Small off-road engines, or SOR, are significant emitters of state reactive organic gas, and major SOR types include lawn and garden equipment and some light commercial equipment. The proposed rule concept would requires all new sales to be zero emissions starting 2025, except for federal preempted equipment. Since the REC proposal would transform most of the SOR to electric by 2040, the MSS scenario is the same as the rule concept. The figure here shows statewide NOx and ROC emissions from SOR under the MSS scenario, which is the blue solid line, compared to the baseline, the black dotted line. The scenario will reduce NOx and ROC emissions by 86 tons per day in 2031. The light-duty emissions also provided as the green line as a comparison here. Next slide. Airport ground support equipment, or GSE, and forklifts are also great candidates for full electrification. Currently, 34% of GSE is already electric. By electrification, penetration has been pretty steady in the past and would likely not increase without incentives or regulatory measures. Forklifts with moderate to low lift capacity are excellent candidates for full electrification. Larger forklifts, however, may be less suitable for full electrification, and the lifting capacity threshold is still under development. For now, we assume all the GSE and the forklifts will go full electrification by 2034. And the figures here show the emissions under the MSS scenario compared to the baseline for both GSE and forklifts. Next slide. The last sector that going for electric is transport refrigeration units, or TRUs. The current proposed rule concepts include zero emission requirements for truck TRUs and zero emission operation requirements while stationary for trailer TRUs. And for TRUs that are less than 25 horsepower, they now have to meet the standard for 25 to 50 horsepower TRUs. In the MSS, we're pushing for a rapid electrification scenario with zero emission TRUs going from 10% in 2024 to 100% in 2023. The figure here shows statewide NOx emission from TRU under the MSS compared with baseline emission indicated by the black line and the emissions under the proposed rule concepts by the orange line. You can see that all TRUs will be like no emissions from TRUs by 2034. Next slide. For the remaining off-road sectors, the major strategy is to accelerate the turnover of older equipment. Construction, industrial mining, or the in-use sector is an important NOx and PM emitter statewide. The current regulation allows continued use of Tier 0 to Tier 2 engines indefinitely, as long as they are meeting the fleet average requirements. The MSS scenario will require full turnover of the Tier 0 to Tier 2 equipment by 2033. And the figure here shows the statewide NOx emissions from construction under the MSS compared with the baseline emissions. Next slide. Agriculture is an important NOx contributor, especially in the San Joaquin Valley area, making up about 18% of its total NOx emissions in 2019. We have had incentive-driven programs such as Farmer since 2009, which has significantly replaced older agricultural equipment. With current incentives, we will be able to achieve 6.5 ton per day NOx reductions in San Joaquin Valley by 2024. The MSS scenario assumes continued incentive programs through 2031. With an additional $565 million, we could achieve another 4.5 ton per day NOx reduction in San Joaquin Valley by 2024, meeting the SIP target of 11 ton per day NOx reduction. The figure here shows NOx emissions from diesel farm tractors under such incentives. Also, if we have another $1 billion, we could further reduce NOx by another 6.5 ton per day in San Joaquin Valley. Next slide. Commercial hovercraft, or CHC, is important because it is close to at-risk communities around the ports. CARB's proposed rule concepts include turning over all vessels except for commercial fishing vessels to cleanest engines and retrofitting with DPF, and adopting plug-in hybrid technology for new excursion boats and diesel-electric technology for new tugboats, as well as zero emission for short-run ferries beginning 2023. However, we do need a lot more reductions to achieve our air quality goals. For the MSS, we included more actions such as adding commercial fishing into the regulated categories and introducing Tier 4 to all vessels in 2023 and Tier 5 in 2027, and adopting plug-in hybrid technology for all excursion boats and diesel-electric for all tugboats by 2030, and also zero emission for 20% of the ferries. The figure shows South Coast CHC emissions under the mobile source strategy compared to the baseline. Next slide. CARB has also been working closely with contractors and the US EPA to evaluate potential new off-road emission standards. Off-road Tier 5 could potentially achieve about 50 to 90% of NOx and PM reductions from the Tier 4 final standard. In MSS, we assume Tier 5 will be adopted between 2028 and 2030. The figure here shows off-road NOx emission benefits from adopting Tier 5 in South Coast and statewide. The emissions achieved from federal preempt and non-preempt equipment are very close to each other, as you can see in the bar chart here. In total, we can achieve about 11 ton per day NOx reduction in 2035 and 19 ton per day in 2045. Statewide from adopting Tier 5. Other than Tier 5, we're also looking into potential off-road OBD standards to ensure that engines have low emissions during their entire service lives, and potential GHG standards to tackle climate impacts. Next slide. Off-road diesel use is projected to reach about 2.1 billion gallons by 2045, which is equivalent to 490,000 heavy-duty trucks. To achieve GHG reductions from off-road, we need wide-scale hybridization and electrification. Despite technology and infrastructure difficulties in off-road hybridization, there are already numerous commercial hybrid vehicles available in construction, mining, and industrial sector, and that's without any incentives from us. Global hybrid powertrain production was around 3% in 2017. Current commercial and demonstration off-road hybrid projects show an average of 25% improvement on efficiency. In the MSS scenario, we assume that wide-scale hybridization and electrification penetration for off-road diesel engines started in 2018, and with an overall GHG reduction goal of 12% by 2030 and 30% by 2040. Next slide. The figure here shows off-road diesel fuel use under the hybridization scenario, and all the shaded area indicates hybrid or electric equipment here for each sector. As you can see, we can reduce the diesel fuel use from 2.1 billion to 1.4 billion by 2050 under hybridization, which is about 34% diesel use reduction. Next slide. Here is a summary of all the benefits achieved from the 2020 mobile source strategy. The pie chart here shows the emission distributions among stationary, area-wide, on-road, and off-road emission sectors in 2031 and 2037. MSS will achieve about 46% NOx reduction in 2031 and 54% reduction in 2037. In 2037, stationary will be the largest emitting source, bigger than on-road and off-road combined. The right figure here shows fuel use from all mobile sources. The MSS scenario will reduce mobile source fuel consumption by 80% in 2045, while existing programs only achieve about 17% reductions. With that, I pass it on to Ariel to open up for questions.
Thanks, Long. So yeah, we're now going to take our second intermission here to take more questions and comments. We are again going to try and do 15 minutes just for questions, and then we will, of course, take the remaining ones at the end of the presentation. So we do want to try and keep somewhat on topic. So we are going to start with the questions we've gotten just since we started this second block of the presentation. So of course, on GoToWebinar, either use the raise hand feature or type something into the questions box. We're kind of doing the same thing we did last time, start with a couple written questions, and then we'll switch over to a couple verbal people who have their hands raised. So the first the first written question we had received since we started the second block was that ACT, that's somewhat of a comment, ACT starts in 2023, model year 2024, and that was from Matt Schrapp. And I think Sarah was gonna respond to that.
Yes, thanks, Ariel. Yeah, so I just want to thank Matt for the clarification on that. He correctly notes that some heavy-duty model year 2024 vehicles will be sold in calendar year 2023, and this is something we do account for in our scenario modeling. Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah. So I think you were going to maybe take the next one too, but the next question said, are the phase-in assumptions used in the MSS the same as that are being considered for the Advanced Clean Fleets rulemaking? Why is ACF not explicitly part of this scenario? Thanks. From Janet Wittick.
All right, yeah, this is a good question. So yeah, note that I just want to note first that the Advanced Clean Fleet regulation is still under development, and they recently had a workshop back in September with some initial concepts, and the mobile source scenario approach for zero emission vehicle phase-in schedule is pretty consistent with these initial concepts, with very ambitious ZEV phase-in assumed for both delivery and drayage fleets to get them to be fully zero emission sooner, and then pretty aggressive phase-in for refuse and buses, and then ZEVs were feasible for all heavy-duty categories in the long term.
Thanks, Sarah. So the next few I think are somewhat similarly related. So I'm going to switch over now to a couple people who have their hands raised, and we'll take those and then come back to the written questions. So the first person who has their hand raised was Ryan Kenny. So Ryan, I think I have unmuted you from my end, so go ahead and unmute yourself on your end, and then you should be able to state your name, of course, and your affiliation for the record for us.
Great, thank you. My name is Ryan Kenny with Clean Energy, and thank you for taking my question. I have a couple of them I just would like to pose to you. And Kevin McGuy with SoCal Gas mentioned earlier, and he took my questions, but I was wondering about the differentiation between what you mentioned earlier in concepts versus defined measures. And I mention that because SB 44 does state that the state shall recommend reasonable and achievable goals for emissions reductions. And I was just wondering what the difference was between concepts and defined measures.
Thanks, Ryan. Yeah, I mean, so of course, I mean, a lot of people who are here on this call are familiar with, what our 2016 mobile source strategy looked like. And so within that document, there were measures that were a little bit more fully fleshed out. They, were usually specific to one regulatory or programmatic effort. And they had somewhat of a more defined timeline included in them. And so for this 2020 mobile source strategy, given the timeline that we're operating under the requirements of SB 44, we are, trying to take a higher level approach and just start with the first step in the process, which is defining concepts. So they are, kind of more higher level, just ideas that are included, within the scenario discussions in the document, saying, the things that could move us forward. But of course, these will be fleshed out more, as I think I mentioned, in our coming regulatory, or not regulatory, but in our coming other planning documents, including the state SIP strategy, which those will become full measures that will, of course, include commitments and timelines and things of that nature for SIP purposes, and then potentially other planning documents as well. But the requirements of SB 44 are that we have this comprehensive strategy. And so we are doing that from the scenario perspective and including lots of different options for ways that could move forward. So I don't know if Sam or Sylvia has anything else they want to add.
I'll just add one thing. This is Sylvia. I think that it's the document does have goals about what it's going to take for us to, or what we need to do to get there, especially for the heavy duty side of things. And so, and again, acknowledging that we definitely had a lot more time last time, and we want to ensure that, we have more time to develop these measures ultimately and have a more robust public process in that part.
All right, thanks Sylvia, and thanks Ryan for the question. So the next person who had their hand raised was Bill McGavern. So Bill, I have unmuted you on my end, so go ahead and unmute yourself, and you should be able to say your name, of course, for us, and then ask your question.
Yeah, thanks. Good morning. Bill McGavern with Coalition for Clean Air. I'm wondering whether there might be discrepancies between what you presented and the recent executive order. And I understand you haven't had much time to react to the executive order, but just for purposes of clarification, the EO calls for getting the medium and heavy duty fleets to all zero emission in use by 2045 and off-road engines by 2035. It looks to me like you do not have everything getting to zero emission by those dates. And then secondly, the EO talks about continuing to reduce the carbon intensity of fuels after 2030, which I think we all understand to be an extension of the low carbon fuel standard. And I did not see that in your materials. So could you clarify?
Hi, Bill. This is Sam Pornazeri. So I'll start to take on that question. Hopefully that will answer some of the others. You're absolutely right. The governor's EO calls for a full transition of drayage trucks and short hauls to zero emission by 2035, and a full transition to zero emission vehicles for line hauls and other trucks and buses by 2045 where feasible. The current scenarios are mostly built upon a sales requirements as well as turnover requirements. You're absolutely right. By 2045, we're still seeing some out-of-state trucks operating on California roadways that are going to be powered by internal combustion engines. That is coming to where feasible, but we're still looking into that more closely into our advanced clean fleet rule, as well as other potential future rules or incentive programs that will come on board. But your point is well taken, and we're definitely looking into that feasibility portion on when by 2045, on which sectors and how expansive that should be.
Thanks. And then can you also comment, or could someone, about the low carbon fuel standard? And I will say that we would support extending the low carbon fuel standard. In fact, we would support strengthening the 2030 target.
Yeah, this is Joshua Cunningham. Bill, I can take the fuels question. The mobile source strategy does not explicitly get into a specific rulemaking on the low carbon fuel standard, but it is consistent with the direction of the executive order, where for a number of our fuels, we are assuming declining carbon content. The electricity and the hydrogen sectors, as you saw in our slides, are assumed to be mostly renewable by 2045. And we are assuming an increasing amount of renewable diesel in the heavier sectors throughout the mobile source strategy in the later years. So all those are indications that we're assuming some growth in renewables for the fuels across the board for mobile sources, but they're not explicitly tied to a specific low carbon fuel standard rulemaking.
Thanks, Joshua. Okay, so we're going to switch back to some written questions now. The next one that had come in was, according to research by MIT comparing the carbon footprint of the electric Tesla Model S P100D Saloon and the conventional Mitsubishi Mirage, a Tesla driven in the US Midwest produces 226 grams of carbon dioxide per kilometer over its life cycle, with 385 grams emitted by the 7 Series BMW. A combustion engine Mitsubishi Mirage produces even less CO2 at 192 grams. Additionally, manufacturers produce significant CO2 in producing electric vehicles. Is or will this be addressed by CARB in this process? And that is from Joanne Wolfell. My apologies if I'm butchering your name.
Yes, this is Joshua Cunningham. I can take this, Ariel. It is true that you can have varying well-to-wheel carbon footprints for a combination of an electric vehicle with upstream electricity, depending on what grid and jurisdiction you're in. Many states have dirtier grids than California, but clearly that is the reason that in the state of California we have regulations and statutes that are driving those stationary facilities to be cleaner and increasing amounts of renewables in the retail sales for electricity in California. So because of those existing rules in place and consistent in our scenarios, we are modeling that a ZEV in California in the later years will become extremely clean and would have a lower carbon footprint than a conventional vehicle with liquid fuels. But that, like I said, that will vary in other jurisdictions depending on their upstream emissions. On the manufacturing side, it is true today that electric batteries and electric vehicles at times have higher energy intensity in the manufacturing process. So the emissions are going to depend on whether those facilities have more efficient fuel supply and renewables on hand. But even given that, the improved carbon content in the operation of a ZEV offsets the increased emissions at the manufacturing side. But the last note on that is that if those manufacturing facilities are occurring in California, they're going to be stationary facilities and sources that would need to see reduced emissions on the criteria and the greenhouse gas emissions to meet our overall climate and air quality goals.
Thanks, Joshua. The next question was, it appears you're assuming a federal 0.02 grams per brake horsepower hour NOx standard. What is the basis for this assumption? And that is from Steve Berry.
So this is Sam Parnazeri. I'll take that one. So That is correct. We're currently in the scenarios. We're assuming starting 2027 at 0.02 standards. We know that federal EPA is working on the Clean Truck Initiative program and is still identifying technologies capable of reducing criteria pollutant emissions from heavy duty trucks, and is developing data analysis needed to inform this comprehensive rulemaking. At this point, this is just an assumption we made in the mobile source scenarios, and as the regulatory develop, as EPA goes through the regulatory development, we will definitely have more information. The scenario will be refined further.
Thanks, Sam. The next question said, a question that is frequently posed, given the recent heat-related challenges to the California electrical grid, how do we expect the grid to handle this increased electrical demand from ZEVs, especially considering the additional load demand from the heavy-duty sector? And that is from Molly Pearson.
All right, I can take this. This is Joshua Cunningham. Certainly the electric grid in California is going to have to evolve as we scale up the amount of electric vehicles, both light duty and heavy duty, that are providing demands on the grid. But there are a lot of actions already occurring throughout the state agencies and the private sector to move in that direction. A few examples are that the Cal ISO and the PUC continue to evaluate additional rate structures to encourage time of day shifts in when people charge their vehicles. Those will be ongoing efforts to enable behavioral shifts and moving some of those loads to times when there's excess electricity, such as at night. Additionally, SB 350 statutes passed a few years ago directs the Public Utilities Commission to make large investments through the utilities on EV charging infrastructure and investments to provide smart grid technology out there to help manage mobile source electrification. So that's just to say that there's a need to support a shift towards a smarter grid and enable mobile source loads that will be manageable, and we think that is possible. A lot of these issues will be discussed in more detail as we get into the scoping plan, where there's going to be a larger focus on some of the upstream and grid activities.
Thanks, Joshua. I think another one potentially for you to answer was the next one here, which said, have the ZEV scenarios also modeled GHG and possibly NOx at generation, increased natural gas generation replacing ICE, increased renewables generation versus buffering intermittent generation with random charging needs, and how much does the renewable generation need to grow, and how is that energy going to be buffered? Thanks. That's from Mihai Dorobantu.
Yeah, I'll provide a short answer to this and then ask Kathy Jaw to provide additional information on what we have studied. I just generally will say that yes, intermittent renewables create challenges for grid management, and there is going to be a need for base load power generation. That's something that will be studied more completely in the scoping plan process and is being looked at through a lot of the Public Utilities Commission and Cal ISO proceedings to go through on the renewable portfolio standard. There's a lot of investments happening to ensure that we're looking at taking advantage of excess renewables at night, so a time of day strategy like I noted earlier, and vehicle grid integration to take advantage of battery storage. So that's a general response. The grid will need to evolve. Where we have base load power needs, there will be a consideration for whether that natural gas can be leveraging biomethane. But if Kathy Jaw can provide a quick answer on what we do have in our documentation for how we studied upstream assumptions.
Hi, this is Kathy. So we do account for the emissions from upstream for electricity generations and refinery and other productions facility that provided energy and fuel for mobile sources. I don't want to get into all the details and the process and the boundary we define, but we do have an appendix at the end of the mobile source discussion draft that address all the assumption we made for the upstream emissions. Thank you.
Thanks, Joshua and Kathy. So I think that actually is, yeah, we're past 15 minutes here. So we're gonna move forward, and again, we'll come back to all the rest of these questions after we finish up with the slides here. We just, of course, wanna make sure we do get through our slides. So we are gonna move forward. So now that we've gone through all the numerous scenarios, we are gonna pivot here to talk more about the vehicle and equipment costs associated with the transformation of the mobile fleet. So the scenarios just summarized show that in order to meet ambient air quality standards, risk reduction goals, and climate targets, a sweeping transition of the mobile sector, both on and off-road, to zero emission vehicles wherever possible, with cleaner combustion everywhere else, will be needed. As the state moves forward, it is important to recognize that significant public and private investment will be necessary in order to reach the levels of cleaner technology needed in the specified timeframes. To estimate the scope of investment and funding needed, in the discussion draft, we identified the current cost of the needed cleaner vehicle and equipment technologies that must replace our existing higher emitting vehicles and equipment. These estimates are of the current cost of zero emission other clean technologies by sector and have been developed to reflect the unique technological and market characteristics of each mobile source type. Fueling and our charging infrastructure costs and potential fuel cost savings are not considered here, as these items are the subject of other reports being developed through collaboration between CARB and other state agencies, and will also be further explored and quantified during the regulatory process for individual program efforts. We know that the natural rates of turnover to cleaner and zero emission technologies will not occur at the pace needed to meet air quality, climate, and community risk reduction targets, and regulatory efforts alone cannot achieve the volume of turnover required. As such, incentives will play a critical role in achieving our goals and mandates. What you see on this slide is an estimate of the total funding that will be needed to support incentivized turnover of these sectors to the levels in the modeled technology trajectories over the next 5 years. Funding per vehicle or piece of equipment represents either an average or a range based on current funding levels under existing CARB incentive programs. As can be seen here, the funding needed over the next 5 years to provide early reduction and put us on a path to meet our goals is approximately $15 to $30 billion for vehicle and equipment costs alone to accelerate the use of advanced technologies. While CARB anticipates that incentives will be needed for some types of mobile sources for many years to come, it is uncertain at what levels. This slide here represents the cost to align the state's mobile source fleet with the levels of cleaner technology shown in the later years of the 2020 mobile source strategy scenarios. Based on the amount of technology needed as outlined in the scenarios, this shows the approximate cost for each vehicle or equipment category based on current costs of equipment and the population of the relevant fleet in each target year from the 2020 MSS scenario. As technology progresses through development and commercialization, costs generally decrease, so it is likely the costs shown here for many types of vehicles and equipment will go down over time. We show these here to acknowledge that getting the state's mobile fleet to align with the trajectories modeled for the 2020 strategy will take a significant investment from all parties, both on public and private sides. CARB and our partners at the federal, state, and local levels have a long history of supporting the transition to clean technologies through funding at many different stages of technology development and deployment. And this will continue into the future as we push for the unprecedented numbers of clean combustion and zero emission vehicles that are needed to meet ambient air quality standards, near-term risk reduction goals, and climate targets. So we're just about done, but I'm just going to wrap things up by discussing our pathways forward before we get back to our questions. CARB has long worked to reduce the negative effects of air pollution in the state's most highly impacted populations through programs to control emissions from freight transport and other significant sources affecting low-income and disadvantaged communities, and this will continue to be a strong focus going forward. In recent years, CARB and the state have been enabled through AB 617 programs to renew our focus on and engagement with these communities. As discussed earlier, disadvantaged communities experience the highest level of air pollution impacts in California. In addition, AB 1550, which was passed in 2016, requires that at least 25% of California climate investment funds go to projects within and benefiting disadvantaged communities, and at least an additional 10% for low-income households or communities. In that vein, there are many low-carbon transportation projects designed to support disadvantaged communities and advance equity. These include Clean Cars for All, the Clean Vehicle Assistance Program, and the statewide Clean Mobility Options Pilot Project. Many of the adopted measures from the 2016 Mobile Source Strategy will provide substantial emissions and health benefits in these communities. In addition, programs under development and the new concepts discussed here in the 2020 strategy, including the heavy-duty inspection and maintenance program and the locomotive measures, have immense potential to provide additional benefits in communities. Another critical piece of the puzzle moving forward is action at the federal level, which will become even more important in the future. As can be seen on the plot on this slide, mobile source NOx emissions in the South Coast from sources under state control has decreased by 75% by 2019 since 2020, or sorry, excuse me, 75% in 2019 since 2000, and will continue to do so going forward as we implement the programs CARB has on the books and adopt additional regulations. Mobile sources that are primarily under federal control have also seen some reduction since 2000, but without new standards at the federal level, emissions from primarily federally regulated sources are expected to grow over the next decade and surpass emissions from California regulated mobile sources before 2030. Achieving reductions from these sources is critical to meeting the health protective air quality standards and other goals in the South Coast and throughout the state. It was evident from my tables a few minutes ago, significant amounts of funding could be used to support the transition to zero emission technologies. Natural turnover will not occur at the pace needed, and regulatory efforts alone cannot achieve the volume of turnover needed. Increased levels of incentive funding are needed statewide, and specifically in the South Coast and San Joaquin Valley to meet attainment deadlines for ozone and PM 2.5. AB 617 funding is also of great importance and will provide the critical reductions in impacted communities throughout California. Amongst the great needs across the state, CARB continues to push forward to look for new control strategies in all mobile sectors. As we've described throughout this presentation, the 2020 Mobile Source Strategy is establishing a framework for how we will meet the state's goals consistent with SB 44 and EON 7920. There are new regulatory and programmatic concepts that have been recently identified and which will be fleshed out more into more formal measures over the next few years through efforts including the SIP and the scoping plan. As the process on these regulatory efforts and other programs continue, there will be many opportunities for public and stakeholder feedback. For the 2020 Mobile Source Strategy, as I mentioned in the beginning of the presentation, we are on a timeline that requires this to be completed by the end of the year. We will be continuing the iterative scenario modeling process throughout development, and we'll be releasing the 2020 Mobile Source Strategy, the version that will be considered by our board. We'll be releasing that in November for the December board hearing. If you have questions after today's webinar, please feel free to reach out to myself, Ariel Fiddledye, for general questions, or to Kathy, Sarah, or Leong for questions about scenario modeling. To provide written comments on the workshop discussion draft that we released last week, we ask that you send them to our general mailbox, mss@arb.ca.gov, by October 21st. We also have the website shown on the slide here, which we will be using to post updated information and the next version of the document. One last thing before getting back to questions, I'm going to hand over control here to Sarah and Leong to quickly go over and do a demonstration of the tool known as Meta that we have released that shows the technical details of the scenario modeling. So let me do a little switch here. All right, Sarah, I think you should now be able to share your screen and have control here.
Thanks, Ariel. Oh, sorry, I was on mute. Yeah, thanks, Ariel. Okay, so here is the Meta tool for on-road heavy-duty vehicles. There is a very similar tool for on-road medium-duty that I will not go through today, but it has a lot of the same functionality and options. So starting with the README tab, this tab has all the links to the main sheets in Meta that may be of interest to the user, along with more information and details. You can think of this as a Meta 101, and I highly encourage everyone to read through this carefully. If you find you have questions on some of the other tabs, this is a great place to look for answers. So starting with the main tab here, this has a visualization of scenario technology mix and emissions relative to the MFAC 2017 baseline. And then the underlying numbers for these figures are shown in these tables to the right here So for example, if you wanted to see the total number of zero emission vehicles or ZEVs for a scenario, you could look at this column by calendar year. The user may select from a series of scenario options. The combination of options listed here are the ingredients to reproduce the mobile source strategy scenario that I presented. The first option is whether the ZEV phase-in schedule is modeled as a fleet requirement, which assume California fleets follow the ZEV phase-in requirements regardless of whether the vehicle is originally first sold or certified in California, or originally sold out of state and then registered as a used vehicle in California. However, there's another option that assumes the ZEV phase-in applies to California first sold or certified only. The second option relates to cleaner combustion. The default for the second option assumes that California heavy-duty omnibus starts in 2024 and that a federal .02 regulation starts in 2027. However, the user may select the California heavy-duty omnibus only with no federal regulation assumed. The third option is whether to use the ambitious ZEV phase-in for the mobile source strategy scenario, or the ZEV phase-in for the recently adopted advanced clean trucks regulation, those sales requirements. And please note that if this is set to true, the user must select the ZEV sales requirement option because advanced clean trucks sales requirements only apply to California first sold or certified only. And then the last option was in response to some of the comments we received for the beta version of Meta. And so for accelerated turnover, the user can select turnover to ZEV, so that's the mobile source strategy scenario, but alternatively, the user can also select optional low NOx. And then here below, the scenario options are visualization. So for the figure here, you can choose different pollutants like NOx, PM2.5, greenhouse gas, and fuel consumption. And for fuel consumption, there are a few additional options. You can pick the fuel type here, including diesel, gasoline, and natural gas. Moving on to the tech mix assumptions. This has more details on the major inputs for the scenarios on the main tab. And here's a rough estimate of how the recently adopted California heavy-duty omnibus regulation or a future federal .02 regulation will impact the 0-mile emission rate for a vehicle when it's new or the vehicle's deterioration rates. We also have some rough assumptions of how a heavy-duty inspection and maintenance concept or program will impact deterioration. And then down below, in this gigantic table here, for newer vehicles, we assume a pretty ambitious ZEV phase-in for model year 2024 plus. However, the user can customize these numbers with any percentage from 0 to 100%. And then even with this ZEV phase-in schedule, we still need additional emissions reductions through accelerated turnover to meet our air quality goals. So I'll turn your attention to this piece here. The technology will either be ZEV or optional low NOx, depending on what you select here in the main tab. And the user can further customize by adding the number of vehicles turned over per year from two distinct periods, 2020 to 2031 and 2032 to 2045. Note that the default values of ZEVs or optional low NOx are determined by what is needed to meet the South Coast ozone goal in 2031. And finally, all detailed calculations that were used to generate the scenario results are shown in this tab. Please feel free to reach out to me with specific questions about the raw calculations. That is it for the on-road heavy-duty Meta. If you have any questions about this tool after this demo, please feel free to reach out to me. Thanks.
Thanks, Sarah.
Sorry.
Oh no, I just need to switch over to control. I think to Leong to switch over to the off-road side. And just as Sarah mentioned, of course, there are, our contact info is on these slides. So of course, we'll put that back up. And then of course, you can pull it up on the slides online for myself and Sarah and Leong, as well as Kathy. So Leong, go ahead.
Can you guys see my screen?
Yes, it's visible.
Okay. So compared to the off-road meta, it's mostly a visualization tool, so we don't have any calculation here associated, so it will be a bit more straightforward. Here is the main page. It just gives you a brief introduction about the tool and what you can expect to get out from here. And there are little tabs here, like basically shows the results, like detailed results and just the total results and some descriptions. And you can also just click on the tabs here if you prefer that way as well. So first, I'm gonna take you to the results totals here. And so here you can select each of the off-road categories like CHC, CHE, construction, and also all the fields. They have CO2 production, NOx, fuel, PM, and population. For OGV and locomotives, you will have energy instead of population because that's how they estimate the inventory based on the energy used. And also we provide the 3 regions for South Coast, Statewide, and Sunken Valley. And you can see the comparison between the baseline and the mobile source strategy of the data here. If you want to see the detailed results broken down by tier standard, you go to the the results detailed page. It's a similar interface. You can select different categories and different fields you would like, the baseline and the mobile source. You can see how the emissions change, how the tier groups has evolved between the 2 scenarios. So I hope this is straightforward enough. And then also we provide a little bit like the off-road tier 5 results here. So just to clarify, the tier 5 benefits are determined from only the 3 off-road sectors that are not going for zero emissions. So it includes construction, agriculture, and the portable equipment. So here we show the NOx and PM 2.5 reductions for the 3 regions, and for this from 2030 to 2050. And you can see the federal non-preempt engines and the preempt engines, the emission reductions here for each of the 2030 to 2050 in the 5-year intervals and for different regions. We also have this amazing information collection for all the off-road sectors in the scenario descriptions. So you can find most of the details on the scenario here. For example, for locomotives, you can learn that the SIP inventory was submitted in 2011 and updated in 2017, and the updated inventory will be released in 2020, and the data sources for the inventory and what are the current rules, and or are they already being developed, or is also just a concept, and also the details in the MSS scenario assumptions. So you can find all the detailed information here, and the next step for CARB, it will list if there is a board consideration in the near future, it will be listed here. For example, for SOAR, the board consideration will be next year in 2021. So this is so I hope this table will provide you guys with most of the information you need to learn about the each off-road sector and their current status and the details in the mobile source strategies and the next step for CARB. Here is all the detailed data behind all this behind all the results for each category. So if you would like to just to play with the data yourself, it has all the sectors, all the categories, and the scenarios, and the regions, and the fields. Yeah, please let me know if you have any questions or if you would like to see any other information on this Meta tool. All right, thank you.
Thanks, Leong.
Do I need to stop it, or can you just stop it?
Oops, stop. Hold on. I'm just moving back to the questions part of the presentation. So I think right now, hopefully everybody can see the slides again.
Yes.
Okay, perfect. All right, so yeah, we're gonna switch back to questions. So obviously we do have some from the beginning of the presentation that we weren't able to get to, and then from the second little intermission we weren't able to get to. So I think we're going to start with a few of the questions on the most recent group of slides, which were primarily on the cost side of things, and then we'll start back at the beginning. I know this is going to be a little disjointed, but we do want to make sure we don't miss anybody's questions. So I think we are going to start with the cost ones. So I'm just scrolling up right now, and let me see. The first one that came in on those said regarding incentives. On the agricultural side, you noted the MSS scenario requires the continued implementation of incentives through 2031. Is this a realistic assumption, given the fact that even right now, many of the funding sources for those incentives are taking hits due to the state's reduced income from COVID-related economics? And that came in from Terry Maines. So I'll start on this. I just, want to say that in the discussion draft, we do, of course, acknowledge that obviously due to the COVID pandemic and the related effects on health and the economy and everything else, that yes, there is a major effect on the budget this year. And so we know that numbers or funding levels this year will likely not be what we have seen even in recent years, but the intent of what we have put in the document as far as the funding levels is just to show what would it take for us to actually get to the levels of transition that are necessary in the scenario. So that funding table shows you, looking at the 2025 difference in populations from a baseline to the MSS scenario, and what specifically in some cases is from accelerated turnover for trucks and things, what the levels of incentives based on current funding levels that our incentive programs fund, how much total funding that would take that would get us there. So we understand that levels of funding may not be available as high as we need them, but we are putting this out there so that everybody who needs it can have this information about what it would take. So I don't know if Sylvia or anybody else wants to add anything.
No, you did a great job answering the question.
Okay, thanks. So yeah, the next one that was related to costs, I think, let me scroll down a little bit. Sorry, things are a little bit messy in our little spreadsheet. So does CARB estimate the cost to local jurisdictions, cities, counties, and school districts? If not, can it be done? And so I'm assuming that question, and that question was from John Costantino. I'm assuming that question is also related to just like the turnover and potentially incentives from those groups. And so, those costs are not specifically called out, which ones would be, from the public sector. We do, as you saw, estimate, kind of the total costs and then the near-term funding, but we are not specifying, what may come from what source. Of course, especially in the long term, given the fact that, the technology markets will continue to evolve. We can't say how much funding will be needed for incentive in 15 to 30 years from now. So we do not specifically call that out, but it is something I'm not sure. I would actually have to ask Sam or Sylvia if there's something we could potentially look into. Okay, so the next question said, at the ACF Advanced Clean Fleets webinar, staff said that incentives would no longer be needed after 2024. The slide showing costs, as well as today's discussion on incentives, seems to be contrary to what was said at ACF. Does ARB support heavy-duty vehicle or medium-duty vehicle incentives in 2024 and beyond? And if so, is this understood consistently across the agency? And that is from Janet Whittick. So I would say the slides that we had on costs and those tables, were specifically the one for funding where we're talking about incentives. That level, if we're talking about those dollars needed, that is from turnover through 2025. So of course, it's not just looking at what would potentially be funded in 2025, but basically looking at the level of technology that would get us to that level in the scenario in 2025 for ZEVs and the total amount that would potentially be needed according to our current funding levels. So I don't know if Sam can speak more to what is specifically in the ACF, since I'm not as familiar with that side of things.
So Ariel, you covered it really well. So the incentive dollars that was presented was through 2025. It's more in the near term. And I would like to add to that, incentives has always played a very, very important role in bringing the new innovative technologies, as well as funding demonstration projects in California. So they are a critical piece of CARB's and state portfolio in bringing new technology. And just like how we had the incentive programs for the clean vehicle rebate program for light duty vehicles, or the heavy duty incentive vouchers for hybrid trucks, I mean, those have shown to be successful programs in bringing new technologies. So just wanted to add to that, and definitely, I mean, if you have any other question, Jeanette, about advanced clean fleet rule, we can certainly discuss that with the program staff in more details. And with respect to the comment on the necessity of incentive in meeting those targets or not. Thank you.
Thanks, Sam. So the next written question, also related, I think, to incentives in some ways. It says the plan notes that a lot of things need to fall into place to achieve its goals. From a risk management perspective, it seems all the state's eggs are being placed in the ZEV basket. What is the backup plan if things do not go as optimal as the plan clearly states they need to? And that was from John Costantino.
This is Sylvia. I'll go ahead and answer that question. So basically, one of the goals of SB 44 was to, of course, get GHG reductions and maximize criteria reductions, also criteria emissions. And so we think going to ZEVs is the pathway to that. And as per the governor's executive order, we are definitely including feasibility. So we're pushing to ZEVs, we're feasible. And so that is our path forward.
Thanks, Sylvia. Just wanted to note to everybody, it is 11 o'clock right now, so we do still have an hour left on this. We're going to do our best to get to everybody's questions. The next couple also related to costs, so I'll move to those. Agree strongly that increased incentive funding is needed, but given that generating those funds is mostly outside of ARB's control, this strategy should not rely on huge amounts of incentive funds that are unlikely to materialize. And that was from Bill McGavern with the Coalition for Clean Air.
So while we highlight how much it may cost in the near term to get us there, this plan isn't going to completely rely on incentives. Again, these are concepts of what it's going to take to get to our goals in the future. And as we move into developing measures as part of the state SIP strategy and the scoping plan, those regulations will be more defined.
Thanks, Sylvia. So the next one said that it did not appear that infrastructure costs are included in slide 70 to 71. Can you confirm if this is the case, and if so, when would those estimates be made available? That was from Michael Geller. So thank you, Michael, for the question. Yes, that is correct, that infrastructure costs are not included in either the funding slide or the total cost slide, as these are very much the subject of other ongoing efforts, both at CARB through other regulatory efforts, and then also, at other state agencies. We did not try and include those here, since those are complementary efforts that will be, I think, ongoing as time goes on. So I don't know that we can say specifically when the estimates, that would quite align with our individual categories like they are laid out in our document would be available. But I think maybe Sam or Fong can speak to, the report being done at the other state agencies in response to another bill that I cannot remember off the top of my head right now. I'm sorry.
So I can take this. So AB 2127 is a legislative mandate that requires California Energy Commission in consultation with CARB and CPC to pull together an infrastructure development plan for not only light duty vehicles, but also medium duty and heavy duty, as well as off-road. So we are working very closely with them in terms of the level of transformation needed for to meet our both air quality and climate goals, and we're working with them to include some of the results from the mobile source strategy as part of those plans, which will inform the level of infrastructure planning and infrastructure cost that will result from that. So we're working on that, and hopefully the report is supposed to come out later this year or early next year. So we can definitely, once the report is out, we can definitely have more, include some of those conversations in the next round of the mobile source strategy.
Thanks, Sam. So I'm just gonna do one more written question that was related to cost, and then I think we'll switch over and take a few people who have their hands raised, and then we'll come back to do more written questions. So the next one that had come in related to cost said, regarding the capital cost to transition based on technology type, is that in addition to the existing average product cost or in place of the existing product cost, or in the case of full electrification, the replacement of the power source, i.e. that cost is offset by the cost of the ICE? And that came in from Doug Hartley. So yeah, regarding what is included, as I think we've somewhat probably talked about this in relation to other questions, but yes, that capital cost that is included on our funding and our total cost transition for the transition slides. It's an estimate of the total cost, in the case of the total cost of transition slide, the total cost of the equipment as things stand today in 2020. And that is for the new equipment. In most cases, that's ZEVs, or in some cases, you know, a higher tier piece of cleaner combustion equipment. And so that is not it's not an incremental cost as, you know, many regulatory analyses normally show, but it is the total cost of that equipment based on CARB's information from regulatory and incentive program staff. And so, yeah, there are, of course, other factors like savings, well, the savings that could be found from fuel cost savings, which of course will be very substantial in a number of cases for the switch to ZEVs that are not taken into account there. And it is something that will be, you know, more explored within each effort, like regulatory efforts and of course incentive programs as well. So with that, I think we will switch over and take a few people who have had their hands raised for a little while, and then we'll come back to some of the written questions. So the first person at the top of my list with their hand raised is Tom Jordan. So Tom, I've just unmuted you on my end. Go ahead and state your name and your affiliation, and then you can go ahead and ask your question.
Great. So my name is Tom Jordan, and I'm with the San Joaquin Valley Air Pollution Control District. And I just wanted to say I appreciate that your presentation recognized the need for near-term reductions in the San Joaquin Valley and South Coast, and the significant funding that's needed to achieve those reductions. We definitely support the move to zero emissions, but unfortunately, given our air quality status, we can't wait till 2035 or 2045 for reduction. Our timeline's required deployment by like 2025. We definitely are willing and eager to work with ARB to continue to identify funding sources to help make those near-term reductions happen. But I did have one question, and that is, given these longer-term goals, how do we ensure that businesses will be willing to participate and deploy these near-term strategies, potentially zero-emission vehicles and the like, without a chilling effect, seeing that these longer-term goals are basically phasing out to electric? We need to make sure that people are willing to make those near-term investments to put those vehicles on the road today. Thanks.
Thanks, Tom. I'm not sure if Sylvia or maybe Sam or somebody wanted to take a stab at responding to this question.
Yeah, thanks again, Tom, for your you know, support to zero. And we do definitely understand that you know, that there needs to be some action in the San Joaquin Valley now, and we, you know, acknowledge that and appreciate your help in identifying additional funding. We definitely think that, you know, as part of the rulemaking process, when we develop these measures and the next step in this process, a lot of these concerns of what you're talking about will be addressed. So we definitely know that, you know, the governor's goal is to get to zero, and getting to zero maximizes the emission reduction. But we do understand that, you know, when we're developing regulations, we need to consider many aspects. So again, we appreciate your comment.
Thanks, Sylvia. So the next person who had their hand raised is Ryan Kenny again. So I will go ahead and unmute you, Ryan. You're now unmuted, so you should be able to, again, state your name and step for the record.
Yeah, thank you for taking my question. Again, this is Ryan Kenny with Clean Energy. I just have a question about near-term emission reductions. SB 44 specifically mentions deployment. And I know a few things that you're looking at incorporating here is the EO, which has a 2045 deadline for heavy duty vehicles. Omnibus, which doesn't have a 0.2 NOx requirement until 2027. And of course, APT, which really doesn't accelerate zero emission heavy duty vehicles until 10 years from now, if not longer. So I'm just wondering, how does this address near-term emission reductions, especially the 2023 non-payment deadline? And also 2031. I know the bill also mentions 2030 as the first step for meeting these emission reductions, but 2031 is right after that. And also, you mentioned incentives a few moments ago, and CARB, your colleagues are actually eliminating incentives for low NOx vehicles. And the bill mentions deployment, not development. And we got to get more low NOx trucks on the road. And in the 2016 mobile source strategy, there was a goal in there of 900,000 low NOx trucks deployed by the year 2030, and that is missing in this update. So I was just wondering if you could address the near-term emission reductions and also why that 900,000 figure has been eliminated from this plan. Thank you.
Thanks, Ryan. Yeah, so I think maybe Sylvia or Sam was potentially jump in here.
Brian, thank you so much for your question. We definitely, appreciate that. And definitely the 2016 mobile source strategy, we did rely on low NOx trucks for both, in the South Coast and the San Joaquin Valley. Again, this is the next planning. And so we're looking out into the future, another 20 years. And we need to maintain our consistency with the governor's executive order. And so we're, putting together a path forward to meet those goals. But again, as I stated earlier, when we work on these regulations and et cetera, we have a lot of stakeholder input, and, we will definitely be considering all of these comments.
Thanks, Sylvia. I don't know if Sam, did you want to add anything to address like the numbers that we had in the 2016 versus now?
Sure. I can speak a little bit to the point of the low NOx deployment versus ZEV deployment. I mean, as we discussed, or as Sylvia mentioned in this round of mobile source strategy, we're taking a look into the longer term goals of in South Coast, the ozone targets we need to meet in 2031 as well as 2037, and in the mid-century climate goals. We did look into alternative scenarios as was presented for the heavy duty trucks, into more of the optional low NOx standards as well as ZEVs. I mean, as you've seen, there was two different alternatives presented. So in terms of deployment, the near-term targets, obviously, it was, as mentioned in the San Joaquin Valley SIP, it is relying on some of the technologies that are available today. But again, the mobile source strategy was presented today is taking more of a long-term vision for what the technology mixes should look like into the future. So we acknowledge your comment, and we'll certainly look into that. We can certainly circle back with you on that.
Thanks, Sam. So I think we'll take one more person with their hand up, and then we'll switch back to written questions. So the next person who had their hand raised was Catherine Garcia. So I just unmuted you, so you should be able to unmute on your end, and then please do state your name and affiliation for us.
Hi, good morning. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, thank you. I'm Catherine Garcia. I'm policy advocate for Sierra Club, California. Thank you to staff for preparing this mobile source strategy. This workshop has been really helpful, and I appreciate all your time today. This is a really comprehensive plan, and I'm excited to see it. Just a couple notes, though. I want to point out that the IPCC report demands that we cut emissions by 50% by 2030. I think this is important to point out, and that it calls for a more aggressive electrification push and demands that we phase in zero emission vehicles sooner. So CARB's mobile source strategy is really meant to outline a bold path to reduce transportation pollution. And I'm concerned that it's not bold enough to meet California's urgent climate goals and also our critical air quality goals. Many of the targets presented today aren't stringent enough for technology that is already readily available, such as the small off-road engines, cargo handling, forklifts, just to name a few of the off-road sector. I really recommend looking at transitioning starting at 2023 instead of, I think some of the slides showed 2025. In regards to light duty, it'd be really helpful to see additional modeling showing the emission reductions from a more accelerated transition to ZEVs starting in 2030, and would also recommend showing modeling that excludes plug-in hybrids from the vehicle mix moving forward. Thank you again for your time.
Thanks, Catherine. I think either Sam or Corey might start for the on-road or off-road things you had mentioned, and then we might switch over to Joshua to talk more about the off-road, or sorry, the on-road light duty, excuse me.
This is Corey, the manager of the off-road diesel emissions inventory section. I'll just briefly say thank you for your comments. We're looking closely at the feasibility for implementing zero emissions in the off-road sectors. We'll be balancing the amount of time it takes to install infrastructure and start turnover, but we are looking closely at that and trying to get as many near-term reductions as possible. It may be possible for some sectors we can begin with incentives before phasing in requirements for zero emissions. But we are looking closely at that, and I appreciate your comment. And I'll bounce it to the on-road team for the on-road side.
Yeah, hi, Ariel. This is Joshua Cunningham. I can take the light duty portion. I appreciate the question and the comment on the light duty strategies. We do intend to continue looking at additional scenarios. I can't commit to them being in the next draft, but we know that we need to study additional strategies on electrification, both in terms of sales and potentially accelerated turnover in the later years. So that will be partially explored through the scoping plan process, but also through our regulatory process. So I just want to generally say those are valuable sensitivity cases we could look at. But I do want to point out that there is not a sector-specific target for carbon neutrality or NOx emissions. And so for the purposes of this mobile source strategy, the light duty sector, we pushed as hard as we could to explore what emission reductions we could get. As we get into the scoping plan process, we'll be looking at, as an agency across all sectors, stationary and mobile, how remaining emission sources can be offset with carbon sinks. So it's a multi-sector comprehensive review, and I think I'll leave it there.
Thanks, Joshua. So actually, it looks like there's just one more person with their hand raised right now, so we will switch over to that. Sorry, keep going with the verbal, and then we'll switch back to written. So Chris McLaughlin, I think you had your hand raised, so I just unmuted you so you can unmute on your end, and then you should be able to speak.
Awesome, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Sorry, Chris McLaughlin. I'm with the California Cotton Ginners and Growers Association, as well as the Western Ag Processors Association. I had a kind of technical question in terms of switching back over to the ag equipment, the off-road sector. In the second paragraph with the governor's recent executive order, he specifically states the transition to all off-road equipment going to zero emissions where feasible. This creates a major conflict with the current statewide SIP, especially focusing on agricultural equipment and the reduction of NOx by 11 tons by 2023. With those conflicting requirements, I mean, this puts the agricultural industry in a really tough position, and it would probably, from our estimation, it'd probably dissuade a lot of growers and agricultural operations from participating in other programs to replace their equipment, whether it be through incentives or voluntarily. And so with this requirement by the governor in the executive order, we're looking at the transition from this equipment would be to tier 4, and then with this new tier 5 requirement, I mean, the transitions would be faster than what these agricultural operations could, before they could pay off the tier 4 final replacement. And so how does CARB intend to address this major conflict? And we're looking specifically at allow for some reset on useful life for this tier 4 clean equipment, or limit the use of zero or near zero equipment to only new purchases. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris.
This is Sylvia. I'll go ahead and answer the question. And so I definitely want to thank you for all of the amount of emission reductions that have occurred in the San Joaquin Valley. As you've mentioned, the executive order just recently came out, and we're still taking a look at it. I do want to highlight that it says, for off-road equipment, it is where feasible. So we'll definitely be taking a look at this a little bit further, and we appreciate your concerns.
Thanks, Sylvia. I don't know if Sam or Corey had anything further to add.
This is Corey. I think that Sylvia covered it well. I just want to point out that there have been successful programs pushing some smaller equipment into zero emission UTVs and ATVs. There may be significant places in ag where ZEVs are a good fit, and then other places where the cleanest diesel remains the best fit for now.
Thanks, Corey. Okay, so we are going to switch back to written now, since I said we'll be doing that. So this is going to be a little bit of a disjoint, but we are going to go back to the top with the ones we didn't get to in our first intermission, just so that we make sure we, of course, are not missing anybody's question throughout the entire presentation. So let me get back to where we were in our first intermission. So this will be potentially related to some of the on-road light duty portion side of things. The next question that we hadn't been able to get to said, oh, when will the workshop recording be available? And that was from Joanne Wolfel. And that, of course, I can answer. We just have to go through our public information office, so it may take up to a couple weeks or so, but we will try and get it online as quickly as possible. Of course, it will be posted on the same website where we've been posting all of our documents, the 2020 Mobile Source Strategy webpage on CARB's page. So yeah, keep checking back within hopefully a couple weeks. The question that came in after that says, we recommend that you plan for an accelerated retirement program for gross polluting cars using Clean Cars for All as a model. We also recommend modeling 100% carbon-free electricity scenario for 2045 as envisioned by SB 100. And we support your plan to do more to reduce VMT. So this is from Bill McGavern. And so I'm not sure if we might have touched on that when you we had a chance for you to speak verbally earlier, but I think Joshua was going to chime in directly to this question.
Yes, this is Joshua. I didn't hear a question there, but certainly those are ideas that we can consider, looking for incentive programs to help accelerate light-duty older cars. And I did note earlier that the idea of looking at 100% renewables or zero carbon sources on the grid is something that I'm confident the agency will be looking at with our partners with the PUC and the Energy Commission as we get into the scoping plan that's going through its process next year and the year after.
Thanks, Joshua. Next question also, I believe, on light duty kind of side of things, does CARB currently define ZEV as BEV plus PHEV? And if so, will that be the definition for the exec order for all ZEVs after 2035? In other words, will PHEVs be allowed to be sold after 2035? And that's from Michael Geller.
Joshua here again. The executive order does not explicitly exclude plug-in hybrids, or at least we are not interpreting that language to be that way just yet. We're moving forward at the Air Resources Board through varying programs to implement the executive order. And for an example, in the ZEV regulation process, as we update that for model years past 2025, we'll be exploring whether plug-in hybrids need to have tighter caps as they currently have, whether they need to be tightened or not. So that's just to say the executive order does not explicitly define that at the moment, and we will be working to define that in our rulemaking process and other programs. In the ZEV regulation, a plug-in hybrid is part of our TZEV category. As I noted, it has limits for how many credits it can be, automakers can use for compliance.
Thanks, Joshua. The next question just asked, will written comments be accepted after this workshop? And that was from John Costantino. And so we did cover this in some of our later slides, but yeah, just to reiterate, we definitely will be taking written comments. If you have comments, of course, specifically on the draft document or anything within there, we do ask that you send them to our generic email, the mss@arb.ca.gov. And we are asking for comments back by October 21st, if possible. We, of course, also will be releasing another version or draft of the document prior to going to the board. And so we're looking to release the draft, the next version, I should say, in November. And then, of course, we will be going to the board at the December hearing. So there will, of course, be comments, allowed to be submitted throughout this process. We just ask for this first iteration, if it's possible, to have you submit comments to us by October 21st. All right, the next question stated, do you expect that any of the underlying data and assumptions will change based upon further work on MFAC 2020X, or are they now locked in? And that's from Charles Shulock.
Hi, this is Sam Pornazeri. Charles, the MFAC 2020X model development is still under development. And when in the current plan is to release it either later this year or early next year. The scenarios presented today are based on the MFAC 2017, which is an approved or US EPA approved version of the model. So 2020 mobile source strategy will be using MFAC 17, and with MFAC 2020X being out next year, we'll look into using that for future strategy or scenario development.
Thanks, Sam. Okay, next question said, can you explain the reference to low hydrogen fuel volumes in slide 24 and the small amount of H2 related GHG emissions shown in the graph on slide 26? How does this relate to the state's investment in H2 fueling stations in California and the H2 fuel dispensed from those stations? And that was from Molly Pearson. So I'm just going to scroll real quick back to slide 24. And then, slide 24 and 26 for the slides that Molly had mentioned. So these are, of course, on the on-road light duty side.
Hi, this is Joshua. I can take that question. On our sales graph that we showed, we are assuming a growth in fuel cell vehicle sales in the future years. It looks to be about 5% in 2030 and then scales up to something above 20% in 2045. Those are both notably quite a bit higher than today's fuel cell vehicle sales, but the scenario does assume that those vehicles are a smaller proportion of the total ZEVs than battery electric vehicles. So with that balance, the total demand on hydrogen fuel in the scenarios is certainly higher than today, and higher than what we expect to be needed from the AB 800 station investments that was alluded to, but low enough that we felt that we could assume a full renewable supply by 2045. So that's why in the interim years, the volume of hydrogen is relatively low, but in the later years in 2045, because we assumed all renewables, that it is zero on the GHG graphic. So you don't see it at that point because there are no emissions from that supply. But the total demand of that fuel is considerably higher than would be demanded from the current stations. So the investments that we're putting in place for the stations in AB 8 today are really important. And the scenario would build upon that initial infrastructure. I'll leave it at there.
All right, thanks, Joshua. Let's see, the next one said, this doesn't have to be answered out loud, but which CARB staff member gave the VMT part of the presentation? And that was asked by Julia Randolph, and that was Nicole Dolney. Of course, if we have any more questions related to VMT, she will be happy to chime in. The next one said, why is a hydrogen-fired internal combustion engine-driven vehicle not considered to be a ZEV, but a fuel cell electric vehicle is? What is the considered fuel for a PHEV to make it a ZEV? And that's from Peter Prinz Hufnagel. Apologies if I messed up your name.
Yeah, this is Joshua. I can take this. I'll draw a distinction between the regulation and how we handle it versus what we're modeling in the scenarios. In the regulation, the ZEV regulation as it currently stands, hydrogen internal combustion engine vehicles can get partial ZEV credits. That's partly because those vehicles provide some investments and sales of technologies that have applications to electric vehicles, namely the hydrogen storage tank system. But because they have onboard combustion emissions on the criteria emission side, they are not a pure zero emission vehicle. That's the current regulation. In the scenarios and consistent with the executive order, the assumption and the directive in the executive order is electrified vehicles after 2035. Plug-in hybrids do have some combustion on board, but also have some electric drive technology, high voltage battery and drive motors. And so we assume a pretty small amount of plug-in hybrid sales past 2035, but we did keep them included because they provide some contributions to the plug-in hybrid investments and sales and all electric drive capability if it's a large battery with a high all electric range. So I'll leave it at there.
Thanks, Joshua. I apologize, I keep scrolling back and forth here. So I think that might have, there might be one or two more that were on kind of the light duty side of things. This question says, referencing the answer from Joshua concerning hydrogen fuel cell ICE vehicles, similar question, ICE vehicles not being included in the future ZEV fleet, why is this different from current California regs, which allows this variant for ZEV credits as follows? E, credit for hydrogen internal combustion engine vehicles, a hydrogen internal combustion engine vehicle that meets the requirements of subdivision 1962.2 C2 and has a total range of at least 250 UDDS miles will earn an allowance of 0.75, which may be an allowance addition to any allowances earned in subdivision 1962.2 C3A and subject to an overall credit cap of 1.25. And so that came in from Anthony Delazana.
Yeah, this is Joshua again. I think my answer from the prior question addresses this one too. The current regulation allows partial credits for hydrogen internal combustion engines for the reasons I noted earlier. But our scenarios and consistent with the executive order, we're assuming that hydrogen ICE vehicles are not part of the post-2035 scenario planning efforts. But that is separate from our current regulation. So how we handle hydrogen ICE vehicles and future ZEV regulations will have to be determined through our rulemaking process.
Thank you, Joshua. So I think that was pretty much it on the earlier questions on the on-road light duty side. So moving forward, let me scroll through. So I think the next question was during our second intermission. The strategy identifies developed Tier 5 standards for agricultural equipment. Oh, I apologize, I skipped one. Let me go back. Have the ZEV scenarios also modeled GHG? Oh, we didn't answer that one. My apologies. I've got myself mixed up. The strategy identifies developed Tier 5 standards for agricultural equipment. What is Tier 5 and what are the emission levels? Have these levels been achieved commercially? At the bench scale, in discussions with at least 2 agricultural equipment manufacturers, they had no idea what Tier 5 was or what it could achieve. With less than 15 years before this target deadline, how will this be achieved? And I apologize. I don't have the name right in front of me for that question. I think this one may be.
And this is Liang. I'll start to answer this question. So for Tier 5 standard, it's still in demonstration phase, but from the demonstration, we've seen from 75 to 750 horsepower wings, we can see like a 90% reduction in NOx. And for the rest of the lower and higher horsepower wing, we see about 50 to 75% reduction. So we do acknowledge that there's more technical difficulties in installing SCR or DPF for either lower or higher horsepower wings. So that's why we do have like different emission factors for different horsepower wings. And did I answer the entire question, or do you have anything to follow up with?
I'll just add that as we develop Tier 5 standards, we definitely work closely with US EPA and the manufacturers. This, as with the rest of the mobile source strategy, this is not a final regulation for Tier 5. As Liang was saying, this is just based on demonstrations. So there's a lot of work to be done and more demonstrations and more discussions with the manufacturers on achieving Tier 5 for sure.
Thanks, Corey. Just for the purpose of the record, I'll say that it looks like it was Patricia Rodriguez who had asked that last question. Moving on, the next question or statement says that, by the way, I am supportive of a ZEV transition, but a strategy needs to address energy generation too, and that's from Mihai Dorobantu. I think Kathy Jaw was potentially going to address this question.
Thank you. Yeah, I think we are working closely with CEC and CPUC addressing the grid stabilities and how the transportation electrification impact to the grid. So, there's a lot of collaboration work on that.
Thanks, Kathy. So yeah, thank you for that comment. Next question says, for SOAR, what equipment types are federally preempted? And that's from Amy Dow.
Hi, this is Leon again. So for SOAR, the preempt equipment are usually like the bigger transistors and gas-powered air compressors, welders, or pumps larger than 40 cc. And if you go to CARB website and refer to the SOAR 2020 mobile documentation, we have a list of the preempt equipment there.
Thanks, Leon. All right, the next one says slide 48 shows two scenarios for heavy duty on-road vehicles, and the figure on the right presents benefits in terms of volume of fuel saved. Have staff taken that analysis one step further to compare different types of fuels, conventional diesel, renewable diesel, others, to compare the GHG benefits when comparing the projected fleet mix for each scenario? And that was from Michael Geller. And so I'm just scrolling back right now to slide 48, and I think somebody in Sam's team was going to take this question.
Hi, yeah, this is Fang Yan, manager of on-road mobile development section. Yeah, this is a good question, Michael. Thank you. Yeah, we haven't checked the GHG emission benefits about this alternative yet. But as Cassie Zhao mentioned before, like for other scenarios, we have done GHG emission benefit analysis, and you can find out our assumptions in the appendix of the released drafted document. Thank you.
Thanks, Fang.
And just to add to that, this is a good, I mean, as Fang mentioned, this is a really good question, and we'll definitely look into quantifying the benefits, the GHG benefits of this alternative as well.
All right, thanks, guys. So the next slide said, or sorry, the next question, excuse me, says, TRUs are a difficult and expensive conversion for agriculture, especially packing houses, other ag processing facilities that may only run for 3 months out of the year. This will be an economic challenge for the ag industry that may not be cost effective. Has CARB considered this? And that's from Chris McLaughlin.
Hi, Chris. This is Corey Palmer with the Off-Road Diesel Emissions Inventories. So TRUs is actually one of the measures that's in progress, and there is a reg team. So I would say I can definitely follow up with you on email, and we can pull in the reg team. The scenario we have for TRUs is full electrification right now. I know that the TRU team is also looking at alternatives to achieve emissions for plugins, wall-at facilities, just based on costs. So there are definitely considerations of the full cost, and I will follow up with you on email after the webinar.
Thank you, Corey. Next question, are the 50% to 90% NOx and PM reductions for off-road equipment intended to be implemented for all power ranges? And that's from Peter Prinz-Hoofnagel.
Thanks, Peter. I believe I already addressed the question in the previous answer. So for like 75 to 750 horsepower being, we do expect like a 90% reduction for NOx, but for the rest of the horsepower being, we're seeing like a 50 to 75% reductions.
Thanks, Leon. All right. The next question says, we heard Joshua Cunningham say the target under EO 7920 is 100% for drayage by 2035 and for other medium heavy duty by 2045. But the scenario just presented premises 100% drayage delivery by 2024 and 100% for other medium heavy duty by 2035. Can you explain why the scenario is being presented is more aggressive than the EO and much more so than ACT? The ACT was already acknowledged as a stretch when presented in June, and that is from Michael Carr.
So this is Sam Pornazeri. I can take that question. As also mentioned by another commenter, I think it was Bill McGovern, the governor's EO calls for a full transition to zero emission vehicles in drayage and short haul by 2035. And a full transition for line haul and buses by 2045 where feasible. In order to get to that full transition, and I will use the word in use that Bill used, we need to start earlier on in terms of the penetration and ramp up of cells. So the scenarios that were presented today, we're ramping up the cells to 100% by 2035. And in certain sectors, if you've seen in one of the slides where we're showing the ramp up or the electrification penetration for drayage and other sectors, we need to ramp up early on in order to achieve that goal. We can certainly further discuss that with you. That is also something that we already, in another comment we received about the advanced clean fleet rules. We did try to also align with that, where the drayage trucks, public trucks, refuse trucks had a much higher ramp up as compared to line hauls and some of the other sector which have longer term targets. These scenarios, again, ACT is one of the CARB strategies in bringing zero emission trucks on the road. There are other efforts under development, such as advanced clean fleet rule, and the scenarios presented today are not tied to one single strategies. These are reflective of the technology mixes needed for us to meet our longer term air quality and climate goals, and trying to be in line with the governor's recent executive order.
Thanks, Sam. Okay, moving forward, the next question, under the section entitled Mobile Source Strategy Scenario, CARB indicates that staff assumed continued incentive funding opportunities in this sector through 2031. While this is laudable and very much appreciated, it is far from guaranteed. In fact, the current funding programs are scheduled to sunset as follows: USDA NRCS equipped Farm Bill 2023, Carl Moyer end of 2023, San Joaquin Valley Vehicle License Fee Surcharge June 2024. And that was from Lauren Hadjic. And I'm not sure if this is related to probably the ag equipment slide discussion.
This is Corey. Just from it mentioning NRCS, I'm going to guess this is related to ag. Continued funding of the incentive programs is definitely key for ARB, and it's something we'll continue to push in conjunction with the district and with stakeholders. And if there are no funding options, we would look at alternatives for reductions, but certainly our focus is continuing the successful incentive programs long after their current due dates. Basically, we'd look to renew those programs and if possible, even add funding sources, because we definitely think that ag has a potential for reductions and that incentives have been very successful there. So that's our plan going forward.
Okay. Thank you, Corey. So the next question, I could not see any liquid fuel, gas, and diesel proposal in the MSS, even though there are many mobile sources that will be in use for decades to come in every MSS scenario. Does CARB have any plans for liquid fuels? And that's from Stephen Douglas.
So maybe I can take that on, and Kathy or Joshua chime in if needed. So basically the scenarios are presented, or the guiding principles in our scenario development was electrifying wherever feasible, and where electrification is not feasible, trying to use a renewable diesel or renewable gas and renewable fuels in general. We do have an appendix in the mobile source strategy document. It's called Appendix A, which talks specifically about the availability of renewable diesel, renewable natural gas, and renewable gasoline, and the level of availability based on our current understanding, and how they will be used in different sectors to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions. I will definitely recommend you going through that section, or if you cannot find it, please feel free to reach out to me or Kathy Jaw, who is the lead person for developing that, and we can definitely walk you through the assumptions embedded in our biofuel or renewable fuel assumptions.
Oh, go ahead, Kathy.
This is Kathy Zhao. So I want to emphasize that the appendix provide the assumption we have for the mobile source strategies that provide more inclusive provide the upstream emissions for the purpose of this report. In terms of the strategies, CARB is going to start the scoping plan updates potentially next year. So the strategies in terms of the fuel and energies that will be, it's going to be a part of that scoping plan updates. Thank you.
Thanks, Kathy. Okay, next question. With the move to electricity, several questions arise. Electric infrastructure is generally funded through electricity rates, which in California are already some of the highest in the nation. How is CARB addressing the substantial increase in energy rates to fund this mandate? Given PSPS events and serious demand incidents, how does CARB address electricity reliability for recharging equipment? And has CARB considered the increased used battery waste issue that will come with the implementation of this effort? From Lauren Hadjik.
This is Joshua Cunningham. I can take that as best we can at the Resources Board. It's primarily a question on actions at our sister agencies. The Public Utilities Commission clearly is the agency that will work through rate proceedings as renewables and other investments get put onto the grid. They go through rate proceedings to identify that. It is true California's average commercial and residential rates are higher than other states, not higher than all states, but they do tend to be higher. But it is also true that with average rates, the EV drivers are still saving some fuels saving some funding compared to gasoline. As drivers use high DC fast charging, those rates do tend to be higher. So there's a need to encourage charging in the evenings and off-site. But related to the other agencies, I expect in addition to the proceedings that they will be going through ongoing investments in battery storage at the grid level and vehicle grid integration, both of which can provide a way to keep rates lower by taking advantage of excess renewables at night and avoiding peak demand. So I'll leave it at that.
Thanks, Joshua. So we do have one person who's had their hand raised for a while, so I'm going to switch over to that real quick, and then we will come back to written questions. Obviously, we are running low on time, and so we will plan on doing our best, of course, to get through questions. There are a number of written questions still left, so we will look to potentially respond to all the rest of the written questions that we aren't able to get to during the webinar through a written document that we will post online on our website. But for now, we're going to keep moving forward. So John Costantino has his hand raised, so I've just unmuted you, John. You should be able to state your name and go ahead and ask your question.
Great, thank you. John Costantino, and I'm speaking on behalf of various clients who work to produce lower carbon liquid and gaseous fuels. And I don't want these comments to be taken as anti-ZEV, but they seem to be relevant to such a sweeping policy document. The mobile source strategy talks about public and private investment. And when California set up the rules for achieving GHG reductions, they were market-based, and they basically said, bring us all your good ideas. And renewable diesel, cellulosic ethanol, carbon negative biogas, CCS investments, innovative crude technologies, renewable steam, those are all coming in on the way, but they circle around rate of return on liquid fuels. And it just seems like now that when the innovation spectrum is as wide open as it's been, and all these technologies can be exportable, California is changing the rules to focus solely on investment in ZEV technology. The document talks about investment 38 times, but only in terms of ZEV. And following up on Stephen Douglas's comment, and I did see the biofuels piece in the attachment A, but my question is there an analysis, or has CARB done an analysis of the lost opportunity of investments by pursuing an all EV or mostly EV strategy, and what lost emission benefits could be coming from such a drastic shift in policy direction? It takes a long time to get the 5th largest economy in the world to really ramp up and move. And we've been at this for a decade, and feels like a lot of these technologies are just now getting here. And so that's the question. Has there been an analysis of lost investment, or how this will?
Thanks, John. So I think this question might be something that Sam Pornazeri could potentially answer.
Sure. So John, thanks a lot for your comments. We can, so the current, again, going again to the concept of the mobile source strategy, we're trying to, as we're building these scenarios, and again, I would like to emphasize that these are scenarios and the technology mixes that we think can get us to the targets, air quality and climate targets we have in front of us. Again, these are just the scenarios, not necessarily regulatory or policy set in stone. And we are definitely looking at you and other stakeholders who are an expert in this area to provide us with more information, as you said, in terms of alternative scenarios. I mean, I would like to take this opportunity and thank Kevin McGay and others and Janet Tick and others at ZEV who had a close look at the META tool. It was a great tool, in my opinion, to look at different alternative scenarios. We took some of the comments we received, and we're definitely looking into your feedback and your comment on what kind of alternatives can be used to get us to where we need, considering the limitations on renewable fuels and where it can be used, and considering the economy-wide targets for our climate. So we definitely take your comments, and we can certainly have a follow-up conversation on that.
Thanks, Sam. So in the interest of getting to a couple more questions, we are going to move back to written questions here. With less than 10 minutes here, but we'll try and get through a couple more. So the next one said, how is CHE category defined? Is it any equipment operating in a port, or is it a certain machine type regardless of its job site? And that is from Chris Walters. This is off-road, so Corey or Leon potentially can answer.
Hi, this is Leon. So the definition of CHE basically is any kind of vehicle used to handle cargo or perform some routine maintenance activity in ports or the rail yards. It includes like yard tractors, RTG cranes, forklifts, and you could find the detailed definition if you go to our cargo handling equipment rulemaking page or check the inventory document for more details.
Thanks, Phil. Next question, with all the greater use of electricity for transport, what measures are considered needed for improving the grid capability? And that's from Ted Wells.
This is Joshua again. I will just point back to what I said in the earlier comments, that there are existing measures occurring by the PUC, notably the investments by utilities to meet the SB 350 transportation electrification proceedings. There are actions happening by the PUC and the Energy Commission, as well as utilities, to invest in more grid storage. And there is a vehicle grid integration working group across agencies to map out policy actions to enable VGI services on the grid.
Thanks, Joshua. Next question, for construction and ag equipment, does CARB plan to do Tier 5, or does CARB want EPA to lead it? And that is from Shinquin Ju.
This is Corey. I'll just say that whenever we work on off-road tier standards, we work closely with US EPA as a partnership. We try to align wherever possible because that improves the ability of equipment to be used nationwide and in California. So it's something we'll be talking about with them and working with them on as a collaborator.
Thank you, Corey. And yeah, we'll try and get a couple more here, but I do want to remind everybody that these slides that we had posted, or that we used today, they are already online on our website, the one that you see here on the screen for the 2020 Mobile Source Strategy. So these are already available. You can, of course, pull them up as needed. And then we will, yeah, like I said, be looking to get up the video of the webinar today sometime in the coming weeks, as well as potentially getting to answer as many of the unanswered questions that we can. So one or two more here before we run out of time. I think trying to make sure I don't skip anything, my apologies. The next question said that, sorry, we answered some of these ones since we did some in between here things. Okay, there's a related question actually for the off-road sector. Is CARB working with federal EPA to implement a national Tier 5 standard? And that was from Camila Tisera from Deutz Corp. And I think Corey just basically answered that one. We will be working with them on all efforts of that nature. On OGVs, a question that said, for ocean-going vessels, there was not a distinction between US flagged and non-US flagged vessels. Is scope US flagged vessels only? And that's from Theodore Tarabulski.
This is Corey again. I'll just say that currently we're looking at getting reductions from US and non-US vessels using a variety of means, including incentives for cleaner vessel visits or other types of ways to achieve it. So it would be looking at all vessels to answer the question.
Thanks, Corey. Let me see, another question. According to research, oh, my apologies, we already did that one earlier. About heavy duty, one question says, the alternative heavy duty scenario is interesting. It implies that the options are only zero emissions or low NOx. The MSS should look at them as complementary technologies, not one or the other. Any strategy that relies on only one technology is doomed to fail. And that is a comment from Kevin McGuy.
So I'll take that one. Thanks a lot, Kevin, for your comments and as well as your comments on the meta tool. Obviously, as you look at the scenarios, we do have a mixture of both clean combustion technology, such as the HD Omnibus, as well as optional low NOx and zero emission in the mixture. Meeting our long-term climate goals requires significant reduction in the GHG emissions, and our scenarios have been calling for electrifications, again, as in line with the governor's veto. But we're certainly open to look at your suggestions. The new meta tool that has been released has the capability to look at different technologies, and we're open to have further discussion with you on what kind of alternatives, as well as to the question that John Constantino asked early on what kind of technology and fuel mixes you have in mind. Thank you.
Thanks, Sam. So I think that actually is all we're going to be able to get to within our 3 hours today. So I want to thank you all again, of course, for being online today and participating and giving us all the feedback and asking questions. We really appreciate it, and we will, of course, continue to take feedback throughout the process as we continue for the next couple months here to take the mobile source strategy to our board in December, as we previously mentioned. Again, we are asking for comments on the workshop discussion draft by October 21st, if possible. And then, of course, we will be releasing another version of the document that will go to the board that will be released in November for the December board hearing. So yeah, we will, like I said earlier, try and do our best to address questions that we did not get to today and post them online after, you know, of course, we'll take a little bit of time, but we will try and do that, as well as getting the video online after the webinar. So thank you all. And then we look forward to continuing to work with everyone.